We have muted all attendees and ask that you remain muted until you are asked to speak. To ask questions, please use the chat function located at the top. Chat questions will be read aloud by staff during um, question times, and attendees may be unmuted to further discuss the questions if necessary. Please remember to remute yourself after you're done speaking. To ask questions during open forum panels, please raise your hand by using the reactions menu and using the little hand raise icon. And panelists will be able to unmute you so that you can ask your question. Now, I'd like to turn it over for some opening remarks by our CPUC leadership. Welcome, Commissioner Hauk.
Thank you, Tyler. Good morning and welcome everyone to today's workshop. Today we're going to be discussing the upcoming efforts on community engagement in our HighDER proceeding. The overall purpose of this proceeding is to consider new and improved approaches to electric distribution planning and operations in order to accommodate the anticipated high growth of distributed energy resources, or DERs, in California. As part of today's workshop, Commission staff and consultants will be presenting a draft scope of work for the Distribution Planning Community Engagement Needs Assessment Study, which is referenced in the scoping memo for the proceeding. The study is intended to address two main questions. First, what do communities want and need with respect to electric utility distribution planning? And second, how can the utility distribution planning process be improved to better engage local and tribal governments, environmental and social justice communities, local developers to ensure new planned loads and developments are factored into utility distribution planning processes, and local concerns regarding distribution planning are adequately addressed. While the above questions are focused on distribution planning, the information gathered as part of this process and the final study will also help inform other topics within the proceeding, such as the future grid study. I'd like to invite all interested stakeholders to actively engage with different tracks of the HighDER proceeding. I want to again, encourage you to participate as we rely on the considerable knowledge and experience of both the parties involved in this proceeding and those entities and individuals out in the community to help achieve the ambitious goals we collectively set for California. I'm particularly interested to hear feedback either today or through written comments as to the following questions. What level of involvement and coordination with investor-owned utilities and CCAs should occur throughout the study process? And how best to utilize IOUs and CCAs in community engagement efforts? Should the community engagement process include ongoing coordination with our Disadvantaged Communities Advisory Group and our Low Income Oversight Board? And how can we better encourage and promote coordination and collaboration between investor-owned utilities and local and tribal governments in the distribution planning process, as well as how we can effectively include and incorporate community-based organizations and individual communities into the community engagement process. Again, you're an integral part of the process and will help inform our decision-making in this proceeding. It's important that we get your feedback and thoughts regarding this process because the goal here is to incorporate community wants and needs into the distribution planning process, which is needed as we transition to our clean energy future. And I look forward to today's discussion. And with that, we'll turn back over to Energy Division to lead us in talking about the scope of work.
Hey, Tyler, there seem to be a number of folks that are only seeing slide 32. Can you maybe stop sharing and then try, instead of sharing the presentation in Teams, just share a screen with your presentation on it?
Sorry, I was muted. One moment.
I don't know if this helps or confuses things, but I was seeing the correct slide.
I was too. There's a navigation panel that can show up depending on the permissions, and that might have been part of it, but hopefully this reposting, resharing solves it.
Does this work? Are you seeing this event is being recorded?
That's what I see.
Great. Let's move through. All right.
Now you're on the overview slide, presentation over.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'd like to get started, and thank you, Commissioner Hauk, for that introduction. I'd like to get started on the presentation overview. First, we'll be giving a presentation preview of the workshop agenda. We'll be getting into an overview of the HighDER proceeding, as well as an overview of the proceeding steps for the distribution planning, community engagement needs assessment scope of work, and be discussing the purpose and findings of our fall 2022 outreach to community leaders. Here's the workshop agenda. We just had our welcome by Commissioner Hauk, and now we'll be talking about the HighDER proceeding and the distribution planning community engagement needs assessment. After this, we'll be moving on to a distribution planning and community engagement primer by the utilities, where they will present their distribution planning 101 and community engagement pathways. We will then break for 15 minutes and return at 11:30 for a 1-hour presentation of the draft scope of work, where the consultants and energy division will present the distribution planning community engagement needs assessment scope of work. We'll have a 30-minute lunch break and return in the afternoon for a 1-hour community panel, where a diverse panel of community leaders will offer their perspectives on the utility presentation and the draft scope of work. Following this, we will have about 50 minutes for an open Q&A session on any questions from throughout the workshop. And we will close with some next steps to inform everybody of upcoming deliverables and workshops and how you can stay involved in this proceeding. So first, I'd like to give some background on some of California's state climate goals. California has established ambitious goals to address climate change, and among them are the transition to renewable energy generation sources, aiming to have 100% clean energy retail sales by 2045. We also have the goal to electrify vehicles, with all new cars and light-duty trucks sold in California to be zero-emission vehicles by 2035. And electrifying heaters, with all new furnaces and water heaters to be zero emissions by just 2030. All of these goals have one thing in common. They involve distributed energy resources, which will be referred to as DERs throughout the workshop. Distributed energy resources you might know as distributed generation, like solar panels. They can also be energy efficiency measures, energy storage and batteries, electric vehicles, and demand response technologies such as smart thermostats and internet-connected water heaters. It is a core objective of the CPUC's HighDER proceeding to prepare the electric grid for a high distributed energy resource future by determining how best to integrate millions of DERs within the distribution grid to maximize societal and ratepayer benefits from DERs while also ensuring grid reliability and affordable rates. So that is what DERs are. Now I'd like to give a little overview of where DERs are. Here is a simplified overview of the electric power system, or the grid, which in its current formation currently consists of bulk generation, where large amounts of electricity are produced and moved over transmission lines with high voltages. These transmission lines are then stepped down at transmission substations and moved into subtransmission, and then stepped down again to customer level at distribution stations, where they are distributed to their end users through the distribution circuits, also known as feeders. As you can see on the right side in red, we have the distribution grid. This is where distributed energy resources are located on the customer side with solar panels and battery storages and energy efficiency measures, smart thermostats, and the like. So in response to this future that we are anticipating, the HighDER grid planning proceeding was opened in 2021 with multiple goals, but among them is to enable swift evolution of the grid capabilities and operations to integrate solar, storage, electric vehicles and electric vehicle supply equipment, and other distributed energy resources to meet the state's 100% clean energy goals. Another goal of this proceeding is to improve distribution planning, including charging infrastructure forecasting to support cost-effective and widespread adoption of transportation electrification. And another goal to optimize grid infrastructure investments by facilitating community input about planned developments, DER siting plans, and resiliency needs. Another slide on some clarification about this proceeding. This proceeding anticipates a high penetration DER future and seeks to determine how best to optimize the integration of millions of DERs to the grid while ensuring affordable rates. As a point of clarification, this proceeding neither seeks to set policy on the overall number of DERs, nor does it seek to increase or decrease the desired level of DERs. Instead, this proceeding focuses on preparing the grid to accommodate what is expected to be a high DER future and capture as much value as possible from the DERs while mitigating any unintended negative impacts. This proceeding has 3 tracks. This workshop today will inform largely track 1, but also some aspects of track 2. Track 1 is focused on distribution planning process and data improvements, with 2 phases. Phase 1 includes near-term actions on how we can improve the distribution planning process, and phase 2 is distribution planning process improvements. One of the topics of track 1 is the distribution planning community engagement needs assessment, which we'll be discussing today. Track 2 focuses on distribution system operator roles and responsibilities. And among the topics of this track is the future grid study, development, and public outreach, which will also be discussed today. Track 3 is not scoped in today's meeting, but it focuses on smart inverter operationalization and grid modernization planning. Here we can see the current HighDER proceeding work plan. Circled in red, you can see 2 proposed decisions in track 1 at the top in blue, and 1 proposed decision in green in the middle. Coming up in the first quarter of next year, we have a proposed decision on near-term actions to the distribution planning process. And coming up in 2024 at the end, we have phase 2 proposed decision that will be informed by the community engagement needs assessment report and workshop. And in the middle between these in 2023, we have a proposed decision on track 2 that will be informed by the future grid study. So to guide this proceeding, a document of scoping questions were created to inform the work that would be done throughout this proceeding. There are 2 questions that we want to focus on for today's workshop. The first one is a track 1 phase 1 scoping question that asks, what initial analysis is needed for the Commission to determine how best to improve local engagement in utility distribution planning? It's also worth noting that the scoping memo anticipated that Energy Division would conduct a workshop on the scope and funding of potential community engagement needs assessment. The other foundational question for this workshop is a track 1 phase 2 question that asks, are there ways in which utility distribution planning representatives could better engage with local and tribal governments, environmental and social justice communities, and local developers to ensure new planned loads and developments are factored into utility distribution planning processes, and local concerns regarding distribution planning are adequately addressed? A full list of this proceeding's scoping questions can be found in the scoping ruling. Now, among the many Track 1 goals is the goal to improve utility distribution planning to be more responsive to the needs and plans of communities. An external consultant is anticipated to create and implement a distribution planning community engagement needs assessment. And the scope and cost of this needs assessment will be presented at today's workshop, then subsequently submitted for public comment, and may be approved by the CPUC via a future decision. So how did we get to today's draft scope of work that is being presented? Well, over the course of the last few months, Energy Division has held informal outreach meetings, the goals of which are presented here. There are two goals. The first is to listen to stakeholders and gain an understanding and gather information about many things, including community priorities with respect to energy, both electric and gas, community challenges and barriers to adopting clean energy technologies and distributed energy resources, community-specific long-term visions and the role of electric utilities and DERs in achieving those visions, how the CPUC and the California Energy Commission can achieve meaningful community outreach and establish partnerships, and how the utilities can best include communities in the electric distribution system planning. The second goal was to communicate to participants how insights from tribes, community-based and non-governmental organizations, and local governments will be used to inform development of a draft scope of work for a statewide distribution planning community engagement needs assessment, which we are doing today, and gain insights about potential visions, objectives, and characteristics of a future electric grid for California to inform a future grid study to be developed in 2023. Now, over the course of October and November, we held 20 informal meetings with tribes, rural local governments, urban and suburban local governments, community-based and advocacy organizations, and community choice aggregators, also known as CCAs. In total, we talked to about 82 stakeholders from 45 jurisdictions and organizations and 9 tribes. These included representation from disadvantaged community residents and experts. Both the CPUC and California Energy Commission staff participated in all of these meetings. And a meeting summary document is included as an appendix in the draft scope of work. But first, I would like to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the key points we found from these meetings. I'll first talk about some of the key points we found from our meetings with some of California's tribes. They reported having frequent and lengthy outages that had serious and costly repercussions to their communities. Because of these, they had the need for reliable and resilient energy service. Their preferred way to achieve this would be through energy independence by a tribal-owned and operated microgrid powered by DERs. There are some challenges to achieving this vision, though, because the tribes feel that they are not included in distribution planning processes by the utilities. And because of this, they have the need for technical assistance and workforce development to create the plans, implement the plans, and maintain the microgrid once it is implemented. And a priority for these plans is to be able to sell power back to the grid to generate revenue for their tribal community. They also expressed the need to change regulations to reflect and respect tribal sovereignty, and requested that tribes be engaged in regular dialogue when it comes to the distribution planning process. Now we have some of our outreach findings from local governments. We heard common reliability concerns about mass electrification. This can be due in part because many communities face regular and frequent outages. We also heard frequently that affordability is a concern with regard to both rates and DER adoption, and that interconnection times threaten economic viability of projects. Local governments told us that CCAs, community choice aggregators, are embedded in communities and are trusted to deliver programs, subsidies, and rebates. And in terms of future outreach, local governments made sure that we knew to prioritize relational engagement instead of transactional engagement and to make outreach ongoing, not just one-time outreach meetings, not just webinars and workshops. And this is important because we're in the beginning of this transition and we have the chance to build in equity from the beginning. And to do this, local governments told us that there's a strong need for language accessibility to make sure that we are engaging with all of California's residents. Here we have some outreach findings from our advocacy organizations that we had meetings with. They told us about widespread affordability concerns from their communities. And they told us that lower income communities want to be part of the clean energy transition, but there are some barriers, and some of these include solar program issues and other program issues with landlord-tenant relationships and multifamily living situations, and a challenge from the community to find trusted installers or contractors. Once again, we heard resiliency and reliability issues when it came to electric service. And in terms of outreach, we heard that outreach meetings need to meet communities where they are and provide compensation to best meet the needs of communities, as well as overly technical discussions not engaging well with communities. So those are some of the outreach findings that we collected from our outreach meetings over the last 2 months. The full summary can be found as the appendix to the draft scope of work. And now looking forward, we have key deliverables coming from both track 1 and track 2 of this proceeding. Track 1, we have the distribution planning community engagement needs assessment. We are anticipating to hire a team and begin the assessment in 2023. And we'll be conducting the needs assessment and reporting the findings in 2024. And then CPUC will issue a phase 2 decision informed by this study on improvements to the distribution planning process in 2024 as well. In track 2, we have the future grid study, which asks the questions: what are the options for electric distribution system operator models for a future with a high number of distributed energy resources? And it also asks the question, what are the trade-offs between different models of distribution system operations? This study will be completed in 2023 based on a series of technical workshops and stakeholder engagement to review and comment on the draft study. And the next steps in this proceeding, we have a forthcoming ruling in the beginning of 2023 that will be soliciting comments on this draft scope of work presented today, as well as for choosing an option for a future grid study community feedback plan. Beginning in early 2023 as well, we have the technical workshops for the development of the future grid study, and a 2023 decision considering the adoption of the draft scope of work. That is all the content I have for this presentation. And next we'll be moving to the presentation from the utilities.
Thank you, Tyler. I will bring up the presentation now.
Thank you, Ari. I'll turn it over to you.
Sorry to interrupt. I think we probably want to ask if people have questions about anything that we've presented so far. We do have time on the agenda for that, so maybe we should just take a moment and see if there are any questions about what we just presented, about the overview that you provided, which was excellent.
Yes, great idea, Gabe. Do you have any questions from the chat that you want to pull up? I see a question on the draft scope of work being available. It was sent out to this proceedings distribution service list yesterday, and it will also be presented during this meeting from 11:30 to 12:30. I will also read a question from Catherine. I see the question saying, engaging with all of California's residents seems to not be taking place with the massive BOEM offshore wind turbine farms that will devastate the coastal communities. And the sacrifice to the coastal communities will only deliver 8 to 10% of California's energy. Under the theme of environmental justice, the offshore wind turbines is antithesis to environmental justice.
This is Rob, Tyler, excuse me.
Mhm.
Catherine, that's a great question. I responded to it in writing. I think I don't have a clear answer for you. I think it's a great statement, and I just wanted to make clear that I'm really glad you made it. But we should try to get some raised hands. I see that Ben Schwartz has his hand up. Do you want to turn to that? I'm not sure how to unmute him, or maybe Ben, you're going to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can unmute myself. Ben Schwartz here, Policy Manager with the Clean Coalition. Just following up on a question that I started in the chat and got some good responses to about how the learnings from these interviews with community and tribal leaders will be used at the CPUC. I know that this is primarily about the draft scope of work, but it seems like a lot of the findings that you guys just went over have, you know, direct implications to proceedings where decisions are being made now or will be made, the microgrids proceeding, you know, the NEM proceeding, and some others, interconnection to name another one. So I guess my question is, are those learnings going to be, you know, contributing to the CPUC's decision-making process? It does seem like there was, you know, some clear feedback from the part of communities that they need more options, more resilient options, and more flexibility. So I'd appreciate an answer to that. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of the cross proceeding findings are communicated across the staff, and so we have a microgrids and resiliency team. We've got a net energy metering team, customer generation team, and so as we do outreach like this, we share our findings with them, and likewise, we're tracking findings from their proceedings. And so that's one way. In addition to these slides, we have a document now summarizing all of the findings in an appendix to that scope of work that was issued. That's an official document. And we do expect a ruling to come out, as stated in the ruling that announced today's proceeding, that a ruling will be asking for comments, formal comments on the scope of work. And that whole document, including the appendix, will be brought onto the record. Is my expectation when that future ruling comes out. So that's a general way in which cross-proceeding communication occurs. You know, something is published or presented at one proceeding or under one for one proceeding, and then other staff member track it and take those learnings to their proceeding.
I'll just add, if I could, this is Gabe Petlin with Energy Division, to Ben's question as well. How this proceeding will address what you raised is through the scope of work being adopted and hiring of a community needs assessment contractor who will then conduct significant outreach and then report back on ways from their findings on ways to improve distribution planning to address the concerns of local communities. So it's a multi-year process. I know sometimes that can be frustrating to people that want to see change, you know, right away, but at least what this proceeding is trying to do within this scope, that's the timeline of this particular set of activities. And you'll hear more about that, obviously, when we present the draft scope of work later in the workshop.
And I'll just add too that in addition to the cross communication among staff and their consultants, you know, to the CPUC, their parties often bring up findings from one proceeding and help us make sure that they're covered adequately in other proceedings. So I would just, you know, Ben, to the extent you represent a party, you have an opportunity to ensure that, you know, help us ensure these findings are brought up in the context that you'd like to present at that proceeding.
I see we have a hand raised from Audrey.
Thank you. I want to know if in the documents that will be issued subsequent to this workshop, will the testimony of the local communities be unfiltered. That is to say, you know, in history, you make a distinction between primary sources and, you know, the writing of the historiography. And I wonder if you intend to make available the actual, you know, statements, testimony of impacted communities and representatives and tribes, etc.
You're on mute, Gabe.
Commissioner Houck, do you have a thought about this, or would you like us to share our thoughts?
You know, I think we're considering all the comments today, so we're not making making decisions on this, but if staff wants to give sort of a very general initial thought, I think that's fine. But I think the purpose of the workshop today is to hear comments from folks, and to the extent we can answer some logistical questions about the scope of work that's been presented. But it's not to come to an ultimate decision. We're going to vet the scope of work and review comments before we issue the final draft.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. And I agree, and I would just say that the method that the community needs assessment contractor uses will obviously be determined by a competitive solicitation, and different approaches will be evaluated according to the scope of work. So we may see different, approaches that different outreach consultants will bring to the table in the proposal stage. But we don't have a predetermined method. I mean, I think we want to see the best proposals come forward that can achieve the goals, which you'll hear about in the afternoon, about what we're trying to learn from the study and how that input can be taken into the proceedings. So it's not determined, the exact form of how we'll document the input, but I think the goals are what we're focused on, at least today.
I mean, I'll just add, it's a good question, and I think we're thinking about how best to answer it, because there are considerations about whether we're putting in a direct quote or is it a summary, and I just want to clarify that the appendix of outreach findings, those are summaries. It is exactly that. It's a summary of findings. They aren't direct quotes, and so I think we'll just say thank you for the comment. I don't think we have a clear answer for you right now.
Okay.
I don't see any more hands raised. Are there more questions in the chat here? I'm kind of turning there.
I did see a question that I think is important that asks, will the communities that are supplied by Pacificorps in Oregon be included in the scope of work?
So I'll take it. Catherine, I definitely remember talking with you. It was a great conversation, as you recall it as well. And I know you're up north and far west in the state. And, I think all service territories of our investor-owned utilities are within scope. We're focusing on the big three, PG&E, SCE, and SDG&E. We often do that because their service territories are so large, but PacifiCorp as well was included in our outreach, and I would expect that it makes sense to include other utilities to some extent in that outreach that we do, noting the confines of the consultant time and scope of work and all that. But I think it's a great comment, and I think you should make that in writing if you have an opportunity.
I'm not seeing any more questions at the moment. So I think now would be a good time to turn it over to Ari for the utilities presentation.
Can I have one comment, Robert, before we go on? I wanted to point out, I mean, Oregon is outside the jurisdiction of the CPUC. So I'm not sure if the question was aimed at whether any, decisions that are made due to this would apply to the areas within Pacific Corp that are out of state of California, and that's what the question to me.
Jose, she's not out of state though. Let's just make it clear. Catherine is representing a community that is also a tribal community that is definitely within the state of California.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
You got it.
Okay, thank you. I think now we are ready to turn it over to the utility presentation.
All right, can you see this presentation slide?
I can see it, yes.
Great. Okay, I am Ari Altman from Southern California Edison. I'll be facilitating this talk on DPP 101, the distribution planning process and community engagement. We have a number of speakers lined up from the three big IOUs, Pacific Gas and Electric, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Southern California Edison. As just pointed out, that doesn't cover the entire territory of California, but it does cover the majority. And that's why the three IOUs did come together to prepare this presentation for you. Now, in terms of the agenda, we're going to give you first an overview of the complexity of the future grid, kind of to set the stage for our talk. Then we'll be talking about the distribution planning process. And then in the second half of our joint presentation, we'll be talking about our community engagement. Each of the IUs will have a chance to share their current processes as well as some future thinking about how to engage with the community. I know all of the folks here on the call are going to be very interested in that. I will ask that you do put your questions into the chat, and we will have a chance after each speaker is done to review your questions. Some of the questions, if we can give you a textual answer, we'll type that in. If it does require a verbal answer, we'll get that at the end of each speaker's time. Now, first up, I'm going to invite Marcus Garrett, Director of Distribution System Planning and Strategy at Southern California Edison, to talk about the complexity of the future grid. Mark, are you on with us?
I'm on. Thank you, Ari.
Great.
All right, good morning. I'm going to start off this presentation here, going over some of the complexity of our changing grid. Our grid needs are complex, they're multidimensional, and they've evolved pretty significantly over the last several years. In addition, these needs, not only have they evolved and they're multidimensional, they've accelerated, requiring not only thoughtful near-term actions, but also those actions, we want to make sure that they align with some of the projected long-term needs that our respective service territories require. These accelerating grid needs cover various efforts from wildfire mitigation, such as activities to harden our electric grid to mitigate against potential wildfire risks, to life cycle asset management activities to mitigate safety risks due to asset condition, age, obsolescence, including hardening our cyber and physical security systems to protect our electric infrastructure. Other areas around the state's electrification plans, the grid readiness for California's electrification, being able to prepare that electric grid to accommodate these higher levels of adoption of not only electric vehicles, but also the work that's going on to decarbonize our buildings, our commercial buildings. And then with the increased dependence of what electricity is going to be providing, the dependence on it has gone up. So now the need for having a very reliable, resilient grid, the resilient grid to bounce back from these extreme events is definitely something that is top of mind for utilities. As you can see, I think even in a lot of our customers are looking for different levels of resilience to be able to accommodate their needs. Their expectations have increased. We're also looking to make sure that we're balancing the equity, being able to not only serve the communities that are willing, that are able to adopt these higher technologies, but really covering a larger, more diverse customer base that relies on us to deliver for them day in, day out. And then the needs of what our grid's going to require in not only mitigating some of these risks around the climate, but actually adapting our systems to expect these higher levels of more extreme events and the climate that we're going to experience. Next slide. So what we also have here is you're seeing that the needs are changing. It's tied pretty closely to a lot of these industry change drivers. Our policy, technologies, and market drivers, they're also experiencing rapid accelerations in this change. While on top of all this, our climate continues to evolve. We're experiencing much more extreme weather events. Looking just back a few months at the extended heat storms that we experienced here in California gives us some actual recent examples where we're experiencing this type of acceleration. This acceleration here not only provides a lot of uncertainty to how the utilities are working towards this, but these multiple drivers is putting pressure against our historical forecasting approaches, methods of planning and designing the grid, leading to this uncertainty and complexity that the utilities are managing. Next slide. So as we mentioned here, as you hear this presentation, the grid is evolving, and the investor-owned utilities recognize that our planning also should evolve to factor these multidimensional needs such as electrification, climate change, and the various goals that we're setting forward on California. So looking at all these different efforts, trying to understand all the different needs that our grid is facing, from wildfires to replacing our infrastructure from a life cycle perspective, ensuring that our grid is ready, has the necessary capacity to meet these electrification needs, giving all these different challenges, being able to kind of identify appropriately what the type of solutions, near term, midterm, and long term, to really make sure that as we're touching our facilities, we're really preparing it for all these changes that are forthcoming. Next slide. And so what we're seeing here is our objective is to really deliver these type of optimal outcomes that our communities are looking for as we start to prepare our grids to meet all these multi-dimensional challenges, from safety, understanding our customer needs on how we connect with our communities, but also providing the necessary visibility to be able to work with our communities and understand, they could better understand what work we have going down, how we can best partner, what's ideal for each of those communities. And last but not least, we're also want to make sure that we're trying to be very responsible stewards with the funds that we have to be able to adapt our grid to meet all those challenges there. So really looking at how do we maximize the benefits, the impact for every dollar spent, to ensure that our system is staying affordable for our customers to meet all their evolving and changing needs. All right. With that there, I'm going to pass it off to Mr. Satvir Nagra to talk about our distribution planning process.
All right, great. So Satvir, we did have one question, and I'm Satvir, before we turn to you, Mark, we did have a question about essentially how do we balance the needs of the companies, industry, with the needs of the community. So the question was, it was the primary concern, the needs of industrial companies. I think you can answer that question, Mark.
Yeah, I'd say the primary concern is really all customers. It's not focused on any one segment. I think in some of the industries here that we're focusing on, such as the transportation electrification efforts, or building electrification, those are just some of the various tenants that we have. So it's really looking at all customers and not really focusing on any one and leaving other customers behind. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you for that, Mark. And Saffron Nagar, Director of Asset Planning at Pacific Gas and Electric, you're going to take us through the next set of slides. This is on the distribution planning process. And we actually saw this first slide. Maybe you can kind of tie into the original presentation by Energy Division and talk a little bit about why this is important.
Yeah, hey, thank you, Ari. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, so we're going to just do a overview of the distribution planning to make sure we frame for our later discussion about community engagement. I also want to make sure that the audience asks any questions. This is intended for folks that are not familiar with how distribution planning works, and so no question is too basic. Like I already stated, right, this first slide was covered, right? The main focus of the distribution planning process is the area in green, right? The distribution system. The transmission system is a meshed network. The distribution system typically is radial in nature. However, right, the complexity is changing. We have DERs on the distribution system that makes two-way power flow more complex. So want to make sure everybody understand that the system is getting complex, and there is more than just bulk generation. We have DERs throughout the distribution system. Next slide, please. Just to show how diverse the system is, right? The three large utilities cover over 300,000 miles of distribution lines and 1,500 substations across various topologies, urban, rural, mountain and valley, agricultural, coastal, and there are a lot of differences between the three IOUs territories, and even within PG&E, for instance, there's differences between the various regions when you look at geography, size, weather, demographics, customer types, load and generation types, and the various fire threats at each level. Next slide, please. Now getting to the distribution planning process, which is an annual dynamic process that identifies projected distribution capacity deficiencies and determines mitigation plans to address those projected deficiencies. That all starts with a forecast development, right? We look at the baseline of what is our forecast. That takes into account many steps. We look at what was the peak the previous year, what are we forecasting in terms of load, DERs, all of that is taken into account there. Then we move on to determining what the needs are, right? We'll assess all the distribution grid requirements, does meet those projected load and DER growth, maintain safety and reliability, and then we'll get to evaluation of the mitigation options, right? What are the cost-effective options to address those grid requirements? And then that leads to a project investment plan, which also then feeds into the DIRF and the GNA DDOR. I just wanted to make sure folks understand that this is dynamic, right? We have a preliminary design that's based on local knowledge from the engineers, and that local knowledge is really needed to make sure that we're capturing everything within each of the utilities areas. Next slide. So this is basically taking a deeper dive into the forecast development. So we start with the system level HighDER forecast. That's the CEC's integrated policy report, which is a top down. We look at our substation bank and feeders. We utilize localized variables, right? The bottoms up, such as historical area loading, what are the economic indicators, and temperature data. And we develop 1 in 10 temperature adjusted forecasts. We also factor in a lot of the local information we know about how many applications, right, we have in specific areas for service. What do we have from the customer engagements we've done? What do we know about the particular local areas, right? Our engineers are local and they do have information at the local level that needs to be factored in. Then, of course, we also use the system level DER growth that's disaggregated to our feeders and it's disaggregated to our substations. So we use DER hourly profiles of not just the load, right, but also the DERs. So DERs can be a load, right, increases load like EVs, or they can decrease load like solar and battery energy efficiency and such. Next slide, please. Then we get into the grid requirements, right? We look at impact of projected forecasts on existing capacity, equipment, and configuration of the system. We need to make sure that we're maintaining safety and reliability for customers. Effects of planned projects and transfers, maintain operability of the grid under emergency conditions, diversity of specific geographic load and customer mix. How does it impact our protection schemes? And then, of course, incorporating customer needs. And basically, we're looking to see, are there any thermal capacity needs? And then we're also evaluating voltage and power quality needs. Next slide, please. Determining grid requirement at the substation and bank capacity, right? We're evaluating our substation equipment. We're comparing the existing capacity versus what's the forecasted load. Then we're determining when does that need occur, right? What year? How much is that lead? You know, whether it's how many megawatts or percent. And then we're making sure we take local knowledge to ensure accuracy, right? What's the historical load look like? What's the weather patterns? What customer inputs do we have, including types of load? What might be going on in the local area that the engineers are available, whether it's, you know, from a construction, the economy, the geography, identifying areas that have high potential for new load. So all of that is taken into account as we determine what are our grid requirements. Then we get a little more granular, right? We go down to the circuit level, the line section level of a feeder. We evaluate those line sections capacity versus what's the load that's forecasted. We also compare the voltage profiles to the load limits we have to maintain on the system. We determine overloaded circuits, overloaded line sections. You know, what happens when we have power outages and we need to restore customers, right? Emergency circuit transfer capability. During an outage, during a clearance to do work, we need to be able to move load around from one circuit to the other, and we need to look at that as well. We look at over voltage as well as under voltage conditions, right? We have DERs, we have that two-way power flow that I talked about early on, right? That can lead to an under voltage or an over voltage. And then again, we look at the local engineers' knowledge of the area to determine what are the local development projects that are going on in the area? What are some of the customer inputs? Are there loads changing from year to year? What's the projected growth rate? Does that align with what the engineer is seeing? You know, what types of load? Are they inductive loads? What's the load diversity or variability? And then what's the amount, location, and timing? And then we get into the evaluation of mitigations, right? There's a variety of mitigations that are considered. One could be just transfers. And when I say transfer, what that's looking at is we have feeders that are in proximity to each other, right? One feeder may be overloaded, another feeder might have capacity. So our engineers take a look at that and say, can we transfer load between those feeders to mitigate those needs? Which generally, when we do this, these are either no investments needed or very small investments needed to accomplish that, right? What I mean by small is that we might have infrastructure in place to allow that transfer, switches that can be opened and closed. In other cases, maybe we have the capacity on an adjacent feeder, but we don't have the switch at the right location to be able to transfer that. So that's a low cost investment that we might do that allows us to take advantage of the capacity that exists in the area. Then we might look at small incremental upgrades that allow us to use the capacity, right? We may have a voltage issue that can be solved by installing a voltage device that is much cheaper than doing, say, more work like replacing existing facilities. And then we get to where we might have issues around not having enough substation capacity, right? Determine what do we need to do? Do we need to install a new circuit? Do we need to install an additional transformer at the substation to increase capacity or replace a transformer at the substation? And in some cases, do we need new substations? Right? We need to look at all that. And then, of course, we also want to look at the DER solutions, right? Through the DITF process, sourcing DERs to solve some of these capacity or voltage needs and is also considered. But overall, our guiding principles in that is it cost effective for our customers? Are we meeting all the needs that are needed, right? Is the capacity need being met? Is the voltage need being met? Is the reliability and resiliency need being met? A lot of times, one project can solve all those needs. It can provide the capacity that's needed, maintain the voltage that's needed, as well as provide the reliability for our customers. A lot of times, we may have a need at one substation, but to solve that need, we may actually increase capacity at another adjacent substation because it allows us to do it more cost effectively, right? So that allows us to move the load around and take care of that need from a completely different substation than where the need shows up. So sometimes folks may see, hey, this circuit's on one substation's overloaded, but you're doing a project at a completely different substation. We do that. We look at an overall most economic, cost-effective solution, and sometimes that solution isn't where the need shows up. The solution is somewhere else that allows us to then transfer load to take care of that. We also want to make sure system reliability and power quality is taken into account when we're looking at this. We consider customer needs, what are our forecasted loads, what's the dependable information we have about those future forecasts, what are the impacts on operations, right? Anything we do when we try to come up with the capacity project, right, it's going to have on day-to-day operations. What kind of impact does that have? Does it leave us the ability to be able to restore load after an emergency, after an outage, doing clearances to do planned work? Need to take all that into consideration. We may also mitigate options that address multiple grid needs, right? So like I said, we could do one thing, but it addresses not only capacity and voltage, but reliability needs as well. And then we need to ensure equal treatment for all customers. And I just want to stress there is that all these mitigation options are dynamic, right? We might see in 1 year we proposed a solution that the following year could change based on new information that comes available. Sometimes load goes away. Sometimes more loads may show up that was unanticipated, that wasn't in the forecast. So we got to have the local folks make sure they're watching what's happening in the area, and we have to adjust if that is required. And then lastly, distribution planning tool enhancements, right? Because of the increased complexity, it is driving a need for more advanced distribution planning tools. So utilities are partnering with vendors and improving existing tools or developing new capabilities. Just as some examples, here at PG&E's, this is not an inclusive list, but we are looking at how can we make load forecasting enhancements such as doing scenario planning, report process management, like for the GNID and the DDOR reports, can we automate some of that? What can we do there? We're also looking at distribution planning automation. And when I'm talking about that, is our load flow analysis. Can we automate some more of that? Going to more of a distribution time series analysis versus one point in time, right? The peak load. Refining our load ICA to provide better information to all external stakeholders, as well as the distributed generation tool. So those are some of the things PG&E is looking at and making enhancements. So with that, Ari, we can open it up to questions or that are in the chat, or any hands that are up.
Thank you so much, Satveer. We do have a number of questions, and some of them are going to be addressed in the chat. But I'm going to read out a few questions for you, Satveer, and you can, take your best effort, make your best effort at addressing them. And anything we can't address, of course, we can follow up with or post later in the chat during this workshop. So one question was from Catherine Buchanan. And this question was, will the DPP include decentralizing the power supply to create reliable energy sources? We need localized power generation. So how does that, and there were a few other questions also about local, distributed energy resources. Of course, that's part and parcel of this whole discussion. How does that factor into DPP?
So I think, like I mentioned, the very first slide talked about the bulk system where there's bulk generation, there's the transmission coming in, right? That's one, but we also discussed, right, at the distribution level, there are dispersed resources that are already connected to the system and will continue to be connected, right? That's what this proceeding is about, HighDER future. And that HighDER future includes, we're going to have distributed resources all over our distribution system, and that's going to continue to expand. I don't see it's going to be a mix of bulk generation and distributed generation. I don't think it's going to be entirely distributed, and it's not going to be entirely bulk. It's going to be a mixture of both.
All right, and we have another question here from Lorenzo Christoph. What methods and information do you use to disaggregate, localize the DER growth forecast?
Yeah, so we start with the CEC IPRA forecast for DERs, and then we disaggregate that to the feeder and the bank level using the tools we have. We have disaggregation tools that take into account, premise level information to disaggregate those DERs to the local level.
Okay, we've got another question here. How has distribution forecasting changed with the increasing emergence of behind the meter DER, as well as state and local electrification efforts?
Yeah, so each utility had, disaggregates that IPRA forecast down, right? So it takes all the DER growth that's projected and disaggregates it down to the feeder and bank level. And then we also have what are our actual peak loads that are net of the DERs that are on the system, right? So we are the impact of behind the meter DERs, whether it be solar, whether it be batteries, whether it be energy efficiency, is all netted out in what we see in our peak. And then we add on to that the forecast that we get from the IPER and disaggregate it at the local level to the circuits and the feeders to make sure we're counting for the DER growth that we're seeing.
And I should also mention that participants can view the GNA DDOR reports that each IOU publishes for more information on our disaggregation methodologies. And now I'm going to turn to some other questions. Let's see. From Karen Nelson, would you define in simple terms what you consider the set of deficiencies you plan for?
So the deficiency we plan for are like if we have a feeder, right? If the feeder is overloaded, meaning the load is forecasted to be higher than the capability of the feeder, right? We would plan for that. And then we would also get down to the feeder's section level, right? The conductor along that feeder from the substation all the way to the customer's premise. If any of that conductor's capacity is exceeded by the forecast, we would plan for that. We would also be looking at the voltage on the along that feeder from the substation to the customer premise to make sure that those that voltage is within the limits, and we would plan for that. So those are all deficiencies that we would plan for. And we would do the same at the substation level to make sure our large substation power transformers, right, are within their capabilities, that we don't exceed the capacity of those with our forecast, and plan for either replacing them, installing new ones, installing new feeders, moving load around between substation, between feeders. All those deficiencies are being planned for.
Now we have a great question from Aisha Sisna. When you say local engineer, are you referencing IU staff or some other engineer at the local level in the community? And so the term local has people thinking, oh, does the IOU have local engineers? What does that mean, Safir?
Yeah, so when we talk about local, we're talking about, and each utility varies, but for instance, at PG&E, we actually have 9 different offices where we have engineers through our service territory that are more local, right? They're not all sitting in San Francisco or Oakland or the Bay Area. They're local to the communities and the regions that we serve. And because they have those smaller areas that they're focused on, they know what's going on within those communities that helps them in doing distribution planning. So that's what I meant by local, and each utility may be different on what local is to them. But for PG&E, it's just having our engineers that are out in the communities through our service territory.
And I'm just going to skip ahead briefly because there was just a question posted on what you're speaking about right now. Local engineers, do you have these in disadvantaged communities? How do you distribute? Well, you can speak for PG&E. How do you distribute these local engineers to the communities that need their services?
Yeah, so like I said, the engineers are in 9 of our offices, and they're throughout the service territory. And for instance, the one office, I'll consider we have an office in Fresno, California, right? That serves all the communities in Fresno County, Kern County, Kings counties, and they're local to that. We also have engineers in Kern County, right? So that they're local to that. So they're aware of what's going on. It's not local to every single community within PG&E, but a larger area that is more geographically condensed than our overall service territory.
Okay, next question from Lorene at Climate Action Santa Monica, and she brings up something that a few people have asked about today, and that is that some of the diagrams, the illustrations seem to be very focused on land-based energy sources, particularly solar. How would these diagrams look different in areas where there's wind power or geothermal, and I think maybe even offshore? How do we build that into a HighDER world?
So if we're talking about offshore wind, right, that is something that the California independent system operators had taken into account based on the auctions that just happened, right? How we're going to bring that energy onshore. That's something that's underway to be figured out, what facilities are going to be needed to be built to allow that to happen. But in terms of if there are some small wind machines located out on the distribution system, right, those would be part of what we consider to be DERs, whether it be wind, whether it be solar, energy efficiency, battery, EVs, all that is factored in when we say DERs on the distribution system.
Great. Next question. Let's see. I'm going to go to, yes, Roger Lynn asked, actually, sorry, we addressed this already about local engineers in disadvantaged communities. Next question from Michael Garrett, and I believe he represents the Yorick Tribe, Director of Planning and Community Development there. Michael asks, Sapphire, how has PG&E engaged with communities to determine the nature and scope of DER, including behind-the-meter infrastructure those communities are planning to develop?
I think, Ari, maybe we can leave that question for the community engagement discussion that's coming up.
Yes, that's a great idea. So yes, PG&E will have a chance, and all the IUs will have a chance to talk about that in the next section. So I'm just going to take a few more questions from the chat here. Okay, we have Ben Schwartz from Clean Coalition asks, how can the IUs work more granularly with local communities, residents, and businesses to equitably plan for grid upgrades that will be required due to load growth increases over the next 2 decades? I mean, that kind of sums up the entire presentation, but how would you answer that in a nutshell?
So I think, again, we'll talk about that more, but, currently, like I explained, right, we do our distribution planning process. It starts with the CEC hyper forecast, disaggregated down to the feeder bank level. Then our engineers are getting inputs that they know locally that we then take into account as we're forecasting our loads, making our plans, knowing what the communities might be doing in the area. So that is taken into account, but we will discuss more how we engage and intend to engage with the community to make sure that they're more involved in the distribution planning process.
Great, and I'm just going to highlight one other question. It might be something that we address in the next section. Roger Lynn wants a follow-up about the local engineers. What does the process look like when a local engineer, particularly in an ESJ community, and identifies insufficient service or reliability in that community? And Sapphire, I think that will be addressed in the section to come. Does that sound like something we can address later on, or would you like to take a stab at it?
I can take a stab at it, right? It doesn't matter what deficiency our local engineers find, we're going to address all of them, right? It doesn't matter that it's what kind of community it's in, right? If we identify a deficiency in our system, we are going to come up with a plan to mitigate it.
Well, thank you so much, Sapphire. And now we are going to turn to community engagement, which I can see a lot of the audience is interested in. I'm going to call on Max Beller, who's the Climate Adaptation Project Advisor for San Diego Gas and Electric, and he's going to walk us through some slides from SDG&E's perspective on community engagement. So Max, do we have you on the line?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Max Beller. I'm a Climate Adaptation Project Advisor, but work a lot with a lot of different groups around SDG&E doing community engagement. So I first wanted to kind of touch on an overarching approach that I think is a common theme throughout a variety of our different community engagement efforts, and that is CBOs, first finding those trusted CBOs and CBOs with that lived experience and community knowledge, both on community needs and the best tactics and processes to ensure robust and equitable community engagement. And then from there, we do our actual outreach, getting ourselves into these communities, having those conversations with the CBOs, kind of creating that trusting environment. And then improvement is really crucial to this whole process, going back into those communities again and again, getting feedback to ensure both the outreach itself is improving with each iteration, but also the processes that outreach is informing. Go to the next slide. So with that, kind of talking about those CBOs, it's kind of a more general term, I guess, but it includes local governments and tribal governments especially. So we have a lot of listening sessions, webinars, tours of our Emergency Operations Center, for example. So these local governments can learn a little bit more about our processes internally. And again, having those survey and focus groups, quarterly contact updates, and really trying to make ourselves available to help enable some of these, whether hosting partner agency representatives and being a coordinator where that is the best role we can serve. So kind of talking about a little bit of a success story where we applied that overview I addressed in the first slide is in the wildfire space. So as we all know, it's a really big talking point and really impacts our communities. So we partner with local governments and community-based organizations with town halls, webinars, safety fairs, surveys, et cetera, to really just educate and talk to our customers candidly about wildfire safety and public safety power shutoffs and all the other efforts that we have. So in outreach at first, there wasn't that trust there necessarily, but by continually going into these communities ourselves, having those conversations led to a building of trust, a real ability to have two-way conversations and really learn from each other, both us from the communities and vice versa. And it led to some pretty, successful programs that were initiated by just an idea or a suggestion someone made through a survey or just sitting in a town hall. And again, we go out into these communities every year with our town halls, our webinars, our wildfire safety fairs. And those wildfire safety fairs are where we go into a community, it'll be at a school or like a big open area, and we have ourselves and a lot of different of the key stakeholder groups within SDG&E there with a booth talking about what they do to help with wildfire safety and community resilience, but also a lot of partner agencies like local fire safe councils, CAL FIRE, Forest Service, et cetera. And it's kind of, intended to be a one-stop shop that community members can come to and get all the information they need so they can get prepared for wildfire and public safety power shutoffs and et cetera. And, we have music and food and all that, to make people want to come as well, because it's really important information. So, my role specifically is more involved with climate change adaptation, and there's an OIR related to that has a big emphasis on community engagement. So we are planning on applying a similar strategy to get that engagement and, building off those lessons learned, that great work in the wildfire space, partnering with, for us, what is called the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative. They're a network of community-based organizations, nonprofits, local governments that all in some way or another have either an interest or a work focus in the climate and environmental space, building partnerships with those CBOs who are already doing the work in these communities, and then ourselves doing the engagement. So kind of what I spoke to earlier. Next slide. And so another kind of success story, I'd say, and maybe a little differently, but is the Clean Transportation Group has done a ton of great work and a lot of events where, they partnered with CBOs to put these events on in the community to educate the community about, clean transportation options, as well as, different programs SDG&E might have in relation to those. So there's the EV Fleet Day where we, connected fleets with the vehicle manufacturers, charging providers, public agencies in the media, all those key stakeholders you'd need to really decarbonize your fleet. EV Day, adaptive ride and drive, where, we wanted to let community members know that there are options for those who need special considerations for their EVs. They can still, decarbonize their personal vehicle or their fleets. in the V2G Vehicle to Grid press event where we partnered with a local school district, charging providers, and our project management office to talk about the potential future of the Vehicle to Grid project, specifically with buses. You know, talking about all those community engagement efforts, right? Those are real touch points within the community where, you know, albeit having some specific topics that they are geared towards, by no means are those the only topics discussed. We have a lot of groups collaborate from within SCG and also attend, just showing the different ways customers can get engaged. So this is kind of our talking about our business group and how they engage with our customers to meet the needs of their projects. As you can see on the screen, it's a pretty involved process for customers and for the utility. So engagement's really key before, to let them know that this is an option, but also throughout to ensure, you know, the customer and the utility are staying in lockstep, and that load project can be designed, planned, and incorporated into the distribution planning process. We also have a builder resource center that's kind of intended to be a one-stop customer portal for planning guide standards to help customers get those projects started, to apply for, track projects, upload documentation, make payments, etc. The next slide. So last but not least, you know, last slide I was talking about, or kind of throughout, all those different customer engagement efforts through our different programs, and also through that new service request, which is kind of the most direct line to the DPP. But, you know, all of this is kind of under one roof and intended to all push towards more collaboration and getting all these different stakeholder engagement, whether through distribution, investment deferral framework, grid needs assessment, et cetera. So with that, I will pass it on.
Yeah, now Max, we have a few questions for you.
Yeah.
So this is a great question from Audrey, who's based in Berkeley. She said, "What do you mean by trusted CBOs? Does it mean how it sounds? How do you describe your process for determining which CBOs are to be trusted?"
Yeah, and again, I can speak a lot more directly to the climate adaptation space and a bit to the wildfire space, but you know, some you just kind of know almost, right? Like either trusted because of their subject matter expertise, a CAL FIRE, a Forest Service, a Fire Safe Council, or they are trusted just through our knowledge, right? We have a bit smaller of a service territory, right? So you can drive across it in 2 hours, and that gives us a little bit of an ability to have a lot more finger on the pulse of what's going on in the service territory and, you know, who's doing the work. But a lot of it's also kind of self-identification of CBOs, right? We don't want to tell anyone they can't collaborate with us as a community-based organization. So, you know, if they want to work, we'll explore what that relationship might look like. And again, through that improvement and iterative process, talking to our communities, seeing what works, what didn't, maybe who is trusted in that way, either through the work they're doing or the relationships they have. So hopefully that is answered, but I guess maybe from a higher level, trusted both by the utility, but more so trusted by the community.
Another friendly question. Max, how can we reach out to you as an NGO leader? This is from, by the way, Karen Nelson. "I haven't been aware of your work and outreach. I'd like to do so." And actually, we posted your email address in the chat. But maybe as a broader answer, Max, are you public facing, or are there other folks, for instance, at SDG&E who are? And how does the community interact with you or your colleagues in a public forum?
Yeah, I'm public facing. I've been at the wildfire safety fairs, on events like this, on town halls and webinars we put on, talking more about climate, back to kind of who's a trusted CBO at the wildfire safety fairs this year. I had a little sticker board up where one of the questions was actually, you know, what organization is most trusted? Local governments, emergency response, fire agencies, community-based organizations. But yeah, email me. We have a lot of folks that are public facing and get out in the communities, but I can at least connect you to them. That's probably easier.
Great. So you may be getting some emails after this.
Sounds good.
And we have a question from Catherine Buchanan on electric vehicles. Oh, what type of battery recycling programs or research is being done? So this is a pretty specific question. She also touches on lithium mining, which might be outside of our scope. But do you know of any work that's been done by your utility on battery recycling? I think she's referring to EV, large batteries. But you know anything about that from SDG&E's perspective?
I personally do not. I don't have a ton of exposure in that space, but it's something I could look into and get back to you on. Or I don't know if anyone else on's in a position to speak to that more. But
okay,
I don't know. Would be the
we
answer.
have a few
Sorry.
other folks involved who may be able to address that in the chat. But thank you so much, Max, for presenting on SDG&E's community outreach. We are now going to turn to Southern California Edison. We have Zanko Armenian, Director of Local Public Affairs for SCE, and he is going to be giving SCE's perspective on community engagement. Take it away, Zanko.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Zanku Armenian, Director in our Local Public Affairs team. It's a pretty big team that engages with our local communities, our local governments throughout our service area. Just for the sake of defining the scale of that, we have about 184 local city governments in our service area, over a dozen county governments, and over a dozen tribal governments, federally recognized tribal governments, who we engage with on a regular basis from a local public affairs team perspective. But we also have other teams within our company that also do a variety of types of engagement, starting with our business customer division that has account managers who regularly are in touch with large commercial customers, as well as developers, and kind of keep their finger on the pulse of where growth is happening within our service area, and therefore where there might be growing needs for power delivery. We also have a community and climate equity team that works very closely with our community-based organizations. We have a community engagement team. We have employee resource groups that represent different parts of the demographics within our service area who also engage in the community. So there's a variety of types of engagement that goes on throughout the company, external engagement on a variety of matters. So I just kind of wanted to set that as more of a broad perspective of how we engage. The types of engagement are many different kinds of channels. It can range from town halls, community forums. Local public affairs team, for example, does an annual survey, has been doing it since 2015, I think, 2016, of all our local governments, where we survey all our local elected leaders, as well as public safety, as well as city and county government staff, on a variety of issues, to try and have a finger on the pulse of what's important to them, what's going on in the communities, as well as how are we doing, how's our performance doing as far as our relationship and working, how we work together within their communities. We have a lot of one-on-one kinds of meetings, as well as presentations and proactive efforts to reach and work through local governments, as well as through our engagement with community groups. And then we also participate in a variety of external organizations who put on conferences and things like that, where we are present. We also have a variety of advisory panels, which I wanted to highlight here, which are standing groups that we form, and then we rotate people through it to make sure that it's good representation across our service area. Those advisory panels, as we call them, one is called the Government Advisory Panel, that's comprised of local elected officials from our different regions of our service area. We have a community advisory panel that's comprised of community-based organization representatives. We have a business advisory panel that's obviously representatives of businesses within our service area, as well as our small business advisory panel, so that we make sure we kind of capture feedback from small commercial customers as well. And so it's through these mechanisms that we are engaging on a variety of topics having to do with everything from reliability to as well as where growth is happening, and just making sure we're getting good feedback in terms of how we're doing. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to give a couple of 3 examples here specifically. There's more than this in terms of types of stakeholder input that we seek. So we have an economic development services team that whose mission is to basically identify where growth is happening within our service area, and where we might need to pay attention in terms of making sure that they're connecting into our local planning processes as well. As I mentioned before, our business customer division has account managers who are assigned to primarily large commercial customers, but then through advisory panels, we also engage with some of the smaller business customers. And that's to understand kind of what they're doing. The account managers are basically a single point of contact for those sorts of larger customers and figuring out where their needs are. And so, for example, if we just take zero emission vehicle deployment, large fleets that can require larger amounts of power delivery than normal in a concentrated way. That's kind of the account manager's job, is to make sure they're connected into the planning process, and so that we understand what their needs are, because that sort of planning takes a little bit longer to facilitate. And then there's our environmental health and services team that participates in terms of looking at all the EIRs, environmental impact reports that are filed, and looking at what sort of impact that has on the power grid, and what we need to consider in terms of looking at our planning process. Next slide, please. So in terms of proactive education, larger projects have a more prescribed process in which we engage in making sure we're communicating in the communities where that sort of there's maybe impacts from all that work that might be happening in terms of large license projects. But then to give you an example, more of a kind of a local level engagement, we do an annual regular reliability report, city by city, depending on how they want to hear it. Sometimes it's in-person presentations, taking our district managers out to the local government city council sessions. Sometimes it's just a matter of they prefer to just see the report and then ask us questions afterwards. But essentially, the reliability reports outline how we're doing in terms of all the circuits within that government jurisdiction, what their reliability numbers are in terms of the metrics, and then where there are issues where we need to do additional investments to improve performance of circuits and the grid. That's kind of where we talk about how we're addressing those sorts of needs. One thing I wanted to throw out here today, and we can kind of talk about it a little bit later, maybe in Q&A as well, is, we have a variety of issues that we engage on, wildfire, grid hardening, with regard to the wildfire mitigation plan. We have reliability reports, and so on and so forth. As you go to these audience, the audience is the same for all of these as far as we're concerned. And it can introduce this idea of a little bit of fatigue with these audiences in terms of how much, we go to them with in terms of our issues. We're coming from a world where, on the one hand, people just want to say, we just want the power on and don't bother us with anything else. But in reality, we're headed into a world where we're asking customers to be more engaged in their energy use. And so we want them to be more educated. These are complex topics, as was mentioned earlier. And so part of the challenge here is, kind of how do you engage? How often do you engage? And so looking at a little bit more of an integration in terms of how we look at each of these things, as opposed to layering on one after another, go out and check the box, and talk to them about X, Y, and Z, because we are starting to hear, more and more where it's like, send me the information, we'll get back to you if you're interested in. So I think that's something that ought to be considered in this process as we're thinking about how do we engage with the external audiences. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to kind of cover a quick case study here, and then Mark's going to cover a few, my colleague Mark will cover a few more slides in terms of how all this fits into the planning process so that you get a sense of that. But the climate adaptation vulnerability assessment is something that we embarked on, you know, and we did a little bit more in-depth community engagement for this on a level that we perhaps wouldn't do normally on every other issue. But it was an interesting learning process as we went through this. So we actually formed a climate resilience leadership group comprised of 11 community-based organizations. In order to engage them on this topic and get in deeper, we actually had to make this a paid engagement because of the amount of time that their time it would require and to kind of incentivize. And I know that's something that someone had brought up in the chat earlier. So we actually did this, and it took 3 months for us to just get everyone who was going to help us with this deeper engagement on a more grassroots level, just to understand the topic of climate adaptation and climate vulnerability, and ultimately led to doing a lot of survey work. It led to coming up with reaching out to about 65% of the disadvantaged vulnerable communities, the DVCs in our service area, in order to get in really deep. And so we ultimately are starting to develop what we call the community resilience metric and community impact metric. And these are metrics that we're starting to develop in order to more directly and in a quantifiable way inform our planning process. I can cover more in the Q&A, perhaps, if there's interest, but because it's a pretty deep topic. But just wanted to cover this, and I think San Diego had also mentioned their effort in this regard. And I think while it is a model, you can't do it you can't go in this deep on every single thing, because, like I said, the fatigue issue is a real one. But on this one, you know, since it's a formal proceeding and it's something that we wanted to make sure we learned from and kind of pushed ourselves, extended ourselves further in terms of what kind of engagement we might be able to do. So with that, I'm going to go to the next slide and have Mark come on.
All right, thank you, Zanku. So what this slide's getting into is I'm going to cover what we're doing today, our local planning process, and then the next few slides, we also want to talk about the targeted work that we're doing to improve our processes on streamlining it and finding ways to better work with our stakeholders. So today, when a customer needs to install or upgrade electrical service, even including setting a meter, this request goes to SCE's local planning department. And so what you see here is the high-level view of that overall planning process. So major commercial and residential customers, or even the representatives, have expressed some of the frustrations about some of the local planning work process, the unclear forecasted and length of some of the timelines, and as well as our ability to respond timely. And so these escalated concerns have been sent to, you know, other officials, city officials, or other SE contacts, such as our local government affairs teams. And some things that we've taken to try to improve the communication back in 2018, there was a standard template and a website was created to better explain what we have out here on our planning process, to more clearly identify it and document it so that folks can follow along, provide the necessary forms, and specify type of the work order timelines for some of these customer dependent requirements and our planning steps. Our goal was to increase our customer satisfaction with, you know, getting their projects in service, and as well as giving them more understanding of the overall process from planning to the overall construction and to in service. So we're trying to work with our communities to try to improve the overall process in mind. Internally, we worked with our team members, our local planning teams, and our specific customer reps, and also with Zanku's team on our local public affairs to established a more clear process. What you're seeing here is a 5-step process that gets into how you plan and design a project, how we're able to gather, what information is needed from the customer. And it all starts with just a simple phone call. There's a number out there that you can dial to request service, and then the customer can select, which option they go to kind of go through this process. So our major commercial and residential customers can now use this timeline to kind of work through their project and better plan accordingly. And we have this on our website. So we've been doing a lot of work to communicate, what's kind of our current process that we have system-wide to our customers and other government officials. So this is kind of what we have today. Maybe go to the next slide here. We also understand that, with kind of the increasing, deliverables that are going out there, the major changes, with the new housing, new businesses coming up, we also recognize the need to improve our processes to better adapt. Within SCE, we created an internal initiative. We've been calling it the Power Service Availability Initiative to ensure that the power is available when the customers need it. We know we have work to do in this area, and so we're really trying to take a systematic approach to look at our entire process end to end, but also not just the process, but what are some of the barriers overall. And what you see here is we've broken it up into 4 quadrants here of work that we're focusing on. I'd say the foundational process improvements are really more focused on internal areas, on how we can improve our handoffs internally, how we gather information, how we process information, how we get studies back out. So there's a lot of details that are involved there. On the bottom left-hand quadrant, it's more of the medium to long-term process improvements, things that we see will start to bear fruit, maybe not immediately, but maybe 6 months, greater than a year. And those longer-term process improvements getting really focused on a lot of the engagement with our stakeholders, are the contractors that are building homes, that are working through the SCE process, that are representing a lot of the customers. How do we engage them in that process? On the right-hand side, it's more other things that we're looking at. How do we get better at forecasting where this work is going to show? And what are some of the ways that we're looking at improving our analyses? And then the bottom quadrant on the right-hand side is focusing on what type of infrastructure solutions, what are some ways technologies can help us better maximize our ability to get infrastructure, get service out there quickly. So there's a lot of different initiatives that we're looking in that space. If you go to the next slide here, just focusing on the external engagement. As part of our power service availability, we created a separate external engagement and communications work stream. And really, again, it was really how can we get better at not only providing information to our stakeholders, but also receiving information, and really ways that we could improve our ability to interconnect. So the SE team has implemented a series of town hall meetings in our regions, and are continuing to do so in 2023. Particularly, we started focusing on areas that we were experiencing significant growth and challenges with meeting our power service availability timelines. These town halls have allowed us the team to support our requests. We've been able to bring in our distribution system planning engineers, our local distribution engineers that are more local to the area. You've heard that term before, as well as a lot of our local reps into these meetings to not only discuss what our process is, but to also hear the feedback from those local groups, particularly huge participation with the local builders in those areas, the local government officials that are there, so that we can hear the feedback directly from them, but also increase the dialogue about what the current process is, and really try to understand what we can do better. So far, we've executed 2 of these town halls this year. We had Riverside County back in late September, and we just wrapped up another one in Santa Clarita. We are currently working on developing our plan for our regions for 2023. on how we're going to continue to do those engagements. And each time we do those engagements, really synthesizing the input we've heard and trying to feed that into our PSA, our power source availability plan on how are we, systematically looking at the bottlenecks. What can we do to change the way we provide service and streamline it? These have been an avenue for SE to be proactive with supporting jurisdictions and planning for our economic development as they continue to grow. We've also set up a new construction advisory panel where we're meeting with different parties that are actually doing construction or groups to also seek the feedback from them and understand how we can improve and what are some of the pain points that they're experiencing. So those are some of the external engagement activities that we're taking forward as part of our power source availability initiative. Other things that we're doing, as we heard, getting the grid ready for electrification, particularly transportation electrification, is another area. We recognize that the growth and demand we see there is probably going to be a step change in our system forecast, and it's going to happen pretty quickly. So we are looking at these areas. Some of the things that we're looking to set up in 2023, particularly in the SE territory, is a fleet operator engagement way to connect with the various fleet operators on what their plans are and how we can work with them better to ensure that we're enabling those the service to those. As doing that, we're also going to understand that the infrastructure is going to need to be built out, not only providing service, but it's probably going to require infrastructure that's going to cross through multiple communities and towns to be able to provide service. So as we get into that, we've identified certain areas that are showing up as key hotspots where we're going to have to do some work in infrastructure. And from that perspective, we want to be able to set up other engagement sessions with the communities to better understand their needs as we start to build out our infrastructure and how we could work together on those needs. As doing that, we also want to make sure we're continuing our education, particularly with those customers that have those type of loads of how those loads can impact our grid and how we could further leverage the current grid we have while we're building out the infrastructure. So some of that is through education on load profiles and how to manage some of that there. So better understanding some of the larger customers, what their charging plans or strategies are and how we could enable that. All right, with that, I'm going to hand it off to the next presenter, which I think it's going to go to PG&E.
Yeah, well, actually, we have a few questions, Mark and Zanku. Okay. There are also some big picture questions I want to tee up for the Q&A after everyone's done. One of them was on climate-ready housing and the massive shortage of housing in California and the plan to connect all these climate-ready houses, how that ties into DR. So let's take that at the end. We also had a question on sabotage, which I think is a nationwide. It's been in the news. So the teams can kind of tee up their answers for that at the end. But some specific questions on SCE outreach before we turn over to Anna Brooks. And that is, there was a question from Laureen. What time of the year are the stakeholders surveys sent out? This is for Zanku. Did you say it went to all elected officials? What levels of government? Can you respond to that, Zanku?
Yes, so thank you for the question. We normally do it sometime late third quarter, early fourth quarter, so kind of the fall timeframe. And there's two parts to it. One is an actual survey instrument. So it goes out to all elected leaders in our service area. It goes out to the senior level staff within those local governments, such as city managers, and it goes out to public safety leaders as well. And then following that, kind of in the beginning of each year, we also do a what we call in-depth interviews. So we pick about a couple dozen of the folks from within that sample, specific jurisdictions where we want to do in-depth interviews and kind of get in deeper to some of the questions. So that's just one method. Obviously, there's different things in terms of customer satisfaction surveys and things like that our customer service team does. But if you're referring specifically to that stakeholder survey, that's kind of how we handle it on an annual basis. So we have a good sample now of multiple years where we've been doing this and can kind of identify trends. We can also identify what are the top issues within their communities that they're dealing with as local elected officials, and kind of what's the prioritization for them? Those are the types of questions we ask.
Great. We have a couple other questions about local outreach here. We have a question from Roger Lynn, and this is a follow-up to a previous question earlier in the day. When a local engineer identifies an insufficient service or reliability issue in a community, what does the process look like when that report comes back? And kind of a related question, we also had a question about the 5-step process that was outlined in our slide for new service. So kind of two different questions. Local engineers find a need, or community has a need. Zanku, Mark, you can address those one by one.
Let me just knock out the community side of it, and then maybe Mark can take the planning side of the question. So in terms of, because I also saw in the chat, there was a question in terms of where, what role does community engagement play in this 5-step process? So we have government relations managers who are out there in constant communication with our local jurisdictions. And so they have a finger on the pulse of, as major developments are happening, usually we will end up hearing about it somehow through our elected leaders. So if the connection has not been made with local planning in that process, then our folks will put them in touch with the local district to kind of make sure that the planners and the planning process, is connected to whatever need might be coming around the corner. And so we engage that way. The Economic Development Services team is always out there kind of looking at what sort of new economic development is happening. And so we also have a sense of where in our service area there's growth happening that might drive additional power needs. And so we're making sure that those dots connect. I don't know, Mark, you want to take the actual planning process?
No, thank you, Zanku. Yeah, well, I'll add on the planning process. So if we find the need as part of our planning process, and it's one of the assumptions of demand growth and others, then we'll plan for it. But what I covered here earlier is that not only are we trying to prepare for the long term, but some of these needs may come up much earlier than what was projected. Sometimes they may come up during our interconnection process, where customer or a set of customers may apply, and those demands were not captured in our planning process, which means now we're working on an interconnection timeline. And if those needs come up and it doesn't align with the customer's timeline for service, then our local engineers, our distribution system planning team tried to understand what are ways that we could bring service on in an interim basis, but on a temporary basis. So we look at it as, are there some near-term solutions and options that we could deploy, as part of this interconnection request? And that's where our power service availability action plan, some of the things that we're focusing in on is, how do we leverage some of the newer technologies out there? How do we leverage other ways of being able to provide temporary service while we're building out our grid? So I'm not sure if I answered the question holistically, but nonetheless, if it's identified by our local planning engineers and we validated the demand is going to be there, it gets brought into our distribution system planning team to assess and understand what are the options. Can we meet the timelines? Are there any constraints? And if it doesn't, then we move forward with our traditional plans. But if it can't, then we start exploring, are there other ways that we could accelerate the service availability? Hopefully that answered your question.
And if I can add the other side of the spectrum, I saw that in the chat, someone's asking about just growth. It's not just about growth. As I mentioned earlier in my comments, we do reliability presentations across all our jurisdictions. And so if there are areas where the current, system has reliability issues, that's where the local district, the local public affairs team, working with the local community leaders, we address those sorts of needs as well in terms of what sort of needs there are to improve that reliability anywhere where there's poor circuit performance.
Thank you, Zanku.
Yep.
Thank you both. We're going to turn it over now to Anna Brooks, who's Director of Local Government Affairs at PG&E. Take it away, Anna.
All right, thanks, Ari. I thought I heard Zanku saying something at the very end. Did you have something to wrap up, Zanku?
No, I was just going to clarify the question in the chat. The survey has gone out, the stakeholder survey, I'm sorry, has gone out and has been answered. So we have the results for 2022. We're about to do the in-depth interviews in January. Thanks, Anna.
All right, thank you. Okay, hey everyone, my name is Anna Brooks. I am the director of the local government affairs team for PG&E. So wanted to start on this slide just by giving an overview of our community engagement currently. And it won't surprise you, PG&E, there will be a lot of overlap between what PG&E does and what SCE does and SDG&E does. We share best practices and we tend to engage with our communities in a similar fashion. But I will say, to go through this slide, my team, who manages the relationships with the 293 cities and counties that we serve, as well as our tribal liaison team, our low-income and disadvantaged community team, our state and federal teams, our public safety specialists are all focused on outreach and engagement with local stakeholders and regional stakeholders, which includes, but certainly is not limited to, tribes, local governments, agencies, community-based organizations, and business associations that represent various community and business interests. So every day, similar to my colleagues who presented earlier, our teams are conducting outreach and receiving feedback on a number of different topics. A few of the most prevalent topics are seen here in the blue boxes. We have emergency preparedness, reliability, and projects and programs. Right now, we do gather some limited information from the stakeholders that I mentioned earlier that help inform the distribution planning process. But most of the information that we receive today is through new service applications and ad hoc engagement. So for example, our service planning and customer teams regularly meet with developers and the Building Industry Association for visibility on upcoming projects. But through this process, we've identified several places where we can grow our engagement and coordination with our local communities, and we will get to that in the next few slides. This next slide shows our community engagement. I'm sorry. I have another slide of notes here that's not cooperating. It shows our community engagement in a little more detail and how it functions in our regional service model. So as I mentioned, there are a number of PG&E teams that manage the communication and feedback to communities. Some of them are listed out in that first bullet point. And then additionally, we implemented our regional service model to strengthen PG&E's local presence, our operational performance, and customer interactions. So the graphic on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see how PG&E is organized by region. We have 5 of them. The dark blue is the North Coast. The purple section right in the middle is the Bay Area. The light blue on the left bottom side is the South Bay and Central Coast. The green up at the top is the North Valley, and then the orange is the Central Valley. So each of these regions is led by a regional vice president and has a supporting team that allows PG&E to resolve challenges more effectively with a better understanding of the unique needs in each region, and really have an opportunity to look at all of our programs and services together and how they impact the region and how we can better coordinate those internally for the best community and customer experience. So moving on to the next slide, I won't drain this one, but this slide really depicts the process that the projects go through today. So in many cases, using today's process, PG&E is first made aware of projects and new load through that initial application, that left-hand box. We do ask customers to contact PG&E as soon as they can provide specific details on their project so we can start to evaluate timelines and project needs. But sometimes that process takes a while if new transmission substation assets are required to serve it. It's important to note that there are a lot of factors that aren't shown on this graphic that also affect the project development and timelines, some of which are outside of PG&E's control. So environmental issues, permitting issues, and land use issues affect this timeline and can interrupt this process at some of these points. The other thing that I'd like to note from this slide is between those external factors and the time of between the application and the project construction, customers sometimes decide to cancel or adjust their project details, and it does lead to about a 35% attrition rate in the new business process from the time of application to closeout. So even when a customer is certain enough to make an application, there's a 35% attrition rate. So it does lead to challenges when we're evaluating projected load. And we're factoring that into how we communicate and engage with communities and stakeholders on the distribution planning process, so that we have an accurate depiction of what we need in our system to serve our communities effectively. All right, so now we're going to get into how we will be expanding our community engagement to better inform our distribution planning process. So we talked earlier about this two-way dialogue that's already being conducted with stakeholders and communities on a number of different topics. The feedback that we receive from them help us to shape our programs, inform our projects, and we really want to expand the format that we're using currently to include the distribution planning process so we can get a more complete understanding of the community needs related to distribution planning. So we have various venues similar to the ones my colleagues expressed, where our engagement teams are already meeting with and engaging the relevant stakeholders. So we have one-on-one meetings. We have annual meetings with each of our local governments, which we call local government forums. We have town halls. We have community and business advisory group meetings and others. We've heard from our stakeholders time and again that they want us to consolidate information that we're providing, and so to use their time efficiently. So we intend to gather the input on new planned loads and developments related to DPP using these existing forums and meetings that our teams are having. The input that we gather will be used to validate the needs and make informed decisions at the regional level. And then we are also committed to providing better transparency to communities and stakeholders around our planned investments and timelines. We too have heard the feedback from communities and stakeholders that they're concerned about mass electrification and timelines, and we want them to have full visibility into our plans so that they can plan appropriately and provide feedback to us. The other thing that I'll mention, you'll see that little orange bucket there. It's, we're dedicated to continually improving our process and the feedback loop. We know we have what we think is a pretty solid plan going into 2023, but we also know it's not going to be perfect the first month or the first year that we roll this out. So we will continue to take feedback from our partners, both internally and externally, that will improve our process and coordination as we go. So this next slide really gets into the meat and potatoes of what we want to do. You'll see on the left-hand side of this graphic or flow chart, we're showing the engagements and two-way communication that's already happening, albeit it's not focused on the load needs and the distribution planning process. So right now, as I mentioned earlier, related to the DPP, we're engaging communities and stakeholders, but it's really on an ad hoc basis that relies heavily on applications as well as the PG&E's local knowledge in our planning and engineering teams, which is great and robust, but we understand that there can be another layer and level of engagement from our communities. So moving forward, we intend to continue using these existing forums, but we're going to formalize our process to gather this feedback on electric growth plans. So we intend to ask our communities and our CBOs and some of our business associations, what are your development plans? What are your new zoning requirements for the community? Are you trying to attract cannabis or large industrial loads? Are you looking at 5,000 to 10,000 rooftops coming to your community in a certain period of time? We want to know their project timelines, the types of projects, the likelihood of those projects to materialize. So this stuff, all would be in advance of that application coming into the system, so that we can get a better view of what's on the horizon. The other thing that we plan to ask is, what are the priorities from the local governments? Do they have critical infrastructure planned for the future? Are they looking at a wastewater treatment facility, at fire stations, hospitals, affordable housing? We also want to know how, and we're asking a lot of these questions already about reliability, but how do outages impact you, and whether they can be, or whether they be from a PSPS or planned outages or heat or storm related outages? There were some questions in the chat about what are the most appropriate venues to provide resiliency? Are they community centers, senior centers, schools? We want to hear that information from our communities and make sure that we have an informed process. The other question that we intend to ask, because we hear this a lot, are there government projects that are receiving state or federal funds that have critical timelines to meet, so that if we need to move things around so that a community can build an affordable housing project for seniors, for instance, we take a look at that. So like I said, we intend to ask those questions of our 293 local governments, our 62 federally recognized tribal governments, CBOs and other planning organizations for the year, or starting in 2023. That information will then be provided to the capacity planning and service planning teams. They're going to consolidate it and review it by the functional areas, and then also share it with the regional teams to get an overarching view of the impacts, how the programs overlap, what kind of projects are needed to meet the demands of the local community. And then this will ultimately shape our distribution planning process moving forward. Additionally, we're committed to sharing more information about the distribution planning process and forecasted projects that impact each community, so that they know when these projects are coming and when additional load will be added. So I'll note too, there's a few notes at the bottom, but I realize the font is small. The information that we're going to be gathering from stakeholders is intended to be directional. It's not going to be a guarantee of a specific investment, since, as I mentioned earlier, load is uncertain. And if we plan for every request that we received, we'd have an extremely overbuilt system and rates would go up significantly. So we have to make sure that we are starting to plan and build at the appropriate time. The other piece, my colleague Satveer touched on this earlier, we do have local engineers and planners that are extremely knowledgeable and familiar with the system already and the local needs that are informing the current plan. So we're going to take that internal knowledge and the external feedback, we're going to compare everything against the forecast, and then adjustments are going to be made on a case-by-case basis. And it will be dependent upon a number of factors. We're going to stay in close communication with our stakeholders in local jurisdictions so that projects do move forward and they get closer to that application process and become real. And there's a higher level of certainty around the load needed. We're going to adjust our forecasts and continue to provide updates to communities on the plans and if there are changes to the timeline. All right, and then the last slide here for PG&E is about early community engagement. And we know that this is going to be helpful to inform our process. And this slide shows an example of an area we'd like to engage further with tribes, local jurisdictions, CBOs, and associations. So as load increases, we'll have the need to construct large distribution and transmission projects. Those projects take several years and major financial investments to construct, and therefore a really high degree of certainty is required in order to proceed. It can be helpful, as an example, for developers to include the environmental impacts for those new facilities in their EARs if they're needed to serve the additional load, because and many of you are familiar with this, the CPUC's general order exempts the investor-owned utilities from obtaining approval from the CPUC if those facilities have already been included in the larger project CEQA review. The review has included circulation with the state clearinghouse, and the project's lead agency finds no significant avoidable environmental impacts. So this is just another way that we're going to be partnering with developers and our communities to better align in advance as these new projects and communities add load. This was my last slide, but there was one question from the chat that I have down here, Ari, if you don't mind, about the distribution. It's from Doug Carpa about how the distribution utilities are planning to on ensuring the plans actually get implemented. And I'll just speak to that quickly. So the utilities are committed to serving the needs of the communities and delivering on our plans. I think his question references failing to get new medical facilities up and running. We have seen some delays on particular projects. I saw a statistic yesterday that 99% of the new the applications that we receive and the new load that's requested we are able to serve. There are delays on some of them though. And so as we described earlier, if the utilities need to consider, we need to consider a wide range of needs in our plans. They're dynamic in nature. Some of them may not be connected immediately, but we want feedback and we want to make sure that we are engaging the communities as we make decisions to prioritize projects. So if you do have concerns, we'd love to hear those. We'd encourage you to reach out to our 800 number, and we can provide that in the chat if you have specific concerns about load that is not being served currently. And then there are other connection points that we'll be describing later in the presentation that you can connect with us directly. So this concludes the PG&E portion. I really appreciate my colleagues presenting their engagement processes. Just moving along my slides here. We are committed to further engaging with the communities and understanding your feedback and getting stakeholder feedback. It's something that we do already, but we don't necessarily all do it the same for the distribution planning process. So I think we all see the value and we're all committed to doing that from the IOUs. And we do believe that this can better inform our process. We do want to avoid engagement fatigue. We talked about this. I know I did, and a few of my colleagues did as well. We don't want to set up a separate work stream for this. More is not always better. And we want to make sure that we are taking advantage of the existing relationships and venues where we're already engaging to gather this information. And this is another point, I think I touched on this in the PG&E slides as well. This community engagement piece and asking these questions of our communities is one input into this very complicated multi-step planning process. We want to make sure that data is accurate and that we obtain information and coordination and complete coordination on a timely basis through the IOU's established processes that enables the DPP and enables us to serve our communities effectively. So I think that's it. Ari, is there anything else that I missed?
No, but we have a few questions specifically for PG&E, and then we'll use the remaining time. I know that we have a break time scheduled for 11:15, so people who want to take a break can, but we'll use some of that for questions for all three IOUs. But here's a few questions, Anna, that were specific to PG&E. From Aisha Sisna, how does PG&E plan to further integrate and collaborate with CCAs in the bi-directional distribution planning process?
We see the CCAs as one of our critical partners and important stakeholders. So when I talked about local governments and CBOs and other agencies and associations, we also plan to reach out to the CCAs to make sure they're informed of what we're doing and gather any input that they have. The questions for CCAs may look a little bit different than those who are directly planning to build and construct and add load, but they are an important partner and we will need to coordinate with them.
All right, and then we have a couple of questions from Robert Perry and Roger Lynn about that attrition rate, 35% that you mentioned. Are there efforts this is the question, are there efforts to create an interactive process with the goal of achieving a continuous criteria-based application methodology, essentially to eliminate that attrition? And a similar question, could longer-term engagement help to identify barriers and decrease the attrition rate?
So I feel like maybe some of my operational colleagues may be better equipped to answer this, but I will start by saying we absolutely want to reduce the attrition rate. And we may find through this process of gathering input prior to an application that it allows people to provide input without putting in a formal application that then, would reduce the attrition rate. I think some people put in applications just to get a spot in line or hold, PG&E resources. Hold is the wrong word, or to assess PG&E resources as they are starting to plan their business. We're really committed to continually improving here. So if we find that local input and early input and coordination and communication gives us an avenue to reduce that attrition rate, I think we will absolutely, celebrate that.
Great. And I would like to invite Mark and Satvir and Max and Zanku back on. And we have some questions that I think all of the IUs may want to address. So just feel free to chime in if you have a response. There was a question, for instance, the need for 3 million additional climate-ready housing units by 2030, according to state plan. And this is an interesting, as this was posted by Robert Perry, this is a nexus, kind of a case study on DER, transportation, environment, equity. What's the role of the IOUs in these climate-ready housing communities? Take it away, and anyone who has a response to that.
I'll start off. So as part of some of the engagement work that we're doing, we mentioned here that we're reaching out to the builders in our area. We set up a construction advisory panel where we regroup with the different builders in our service territory to understand their needs. So I think better understanding, what their timelines are as early as possible puts us in a better position for us to be able to plan and deploy the necessary infrastructure for it. Being aware of what they're building behind it, so that we could better understand what type of grid behind it is going to be needed to support it. So I'd say early engagement, early dialogue, and awareness from both groups is definitely some things that I think would be really, really beneficial.
Great, thanks. I'll go to another question here. Let's see. Okay, this is from Stephanie Doyle Mapande from Vote Solar. How much engagement on the actual distribution planning and prioritization of upgrades are communities currently involved in for the 3 IOUs? Who are the usual stakeholders in those conversations?
I'll just chime in. So there's a variety of channels through which that sort of engagement might happen. And so it's, on the one hand, it's us and our responsibility to understand kind of what's going on in our communities, but it's also the responsibility of those who are planning projects to kind of communicate in that planning process, as Mark was mentioning, as early as possible, particularly on larger projects that are going to require longer lead time in terms of the distribution planning process. If it's a large load that's expected and they're expecting us to serve that load, then we need the adequate time to do the planning around it. So we keep our fingers on the pulse of what's going on by making sure we're engaging through multiple channels in this process, whether it's with the business community, whether it's with local government, or whether it's local stakeholders. But it's also incumbent upon those who are actually driving that sort of those sorts of projects potentially that have that kind of impact in the community to communicate to us, as soon as they know that they're going to be pursuing that sort of effort that will require some lead time in terms of the planning.
Okay, we had a question for the 3 IOUs, very timely, from Karen Nelson. How are you planning for sabotage of substations and transmission line sections and the consequences for the consumer? And anyone can take that one on?
I'll just jump in. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, please go.
Yeah, we've all heard in the news, right, what's going on across the country in terms of sabotage. And unfortunately, PG&E has experience with what happened at PG&E's Metcalf station not too many years ago. And as a result of that, right, there were a lot of physical security things put in place. And for PG&E, we're making sure that what was put in place, that is still assessing whether that's still sufficient for fighting off these sabotage events that are happening across the country. We're going to continue to monitor it. We're going to continue to see if we need to make any upgrades. Do we need to increase the number of facilities where we're doing it? All that is underway, and we're assessing that, and we assess that yearly. and it's going to continue to happen, right? So there were a number of physical security and cyber security things that we're doing and that we did after that event that we'll continue to upgrade and update and assess.
I'll just add from the SCE perspective, it's a risk-based approach. And depending on the type of facilities that we're talking about, a variety of measures might be incorporated into the security measures. It could be everything ranging on the extreme in terms of 24/7, guards, to other types of technologies, walls, a variety of mitigation measures based upon a continuous risk assessment of what's going on. And so it's a continuous effort. Obviously, the bad actors out there are always kind of testing the process. And so part of our process is to continually assess risk and then make adjustments as was mentioned.
Great, thank you. I'm going to end with one last question, and this is for all three IUs. And so PG&E isn't on the spot. It's about attrition rates and long lead times, but it's really for all three IUs. Okay, this is from John Kennedy. We often hear estimates of 2 to 10 years before new projects can be connected to the grid. Do you have any information on how many of those applications that fall out of the queue were given such long connection timeframes? And perhaps a corollary question is, why is it 2 to 10 years? Do the IUs have any vision for tightening that up a little bit?
So I can start. It looks like Mark is going to jump in right after me. Sorry, Mark. So on the attrition rates, I don't have the studies in front of me, but I do know that PG&E has looked specifically at the EV charging requests that we're receiving and trying to better understand why we're seeing them back out. And in general, the requests were withdrawn for reasons that didn't have any connection to the timeline or available capacity. It was mostly just, I think, requests because they thought they wanted something, but maybe they found another location to put it, but it was unrelated to the timelines. But Mark, you may have a slightly different answer from SCE.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I'd say similar things there. I'd say part of the effort that we're undertaking here at SCE is that we've also noticed that the timelines jump up, and a lot of that is, some of the larger upgrades and which we're expecting from the transportation electrification side. We're expecting those upgrades to be pretty substantial, that the type of infrastructure, the permitting, the work that's required could take multi-years. And so some things that we are taking action on as part of our parcel service availability initiative is really trying to understand where those are going to show up, and really do we have enough multiple needs in the area that we could proactively start building the grid out in some of those areas. And so that's something that we're looking at, trying to figure out how to tighten those up, not only from the planning side, but also, as I mentioned, on the interconnection side timeframe. If it doesn't show up in our forecasting, we're trying to understand what can we do from being more nimble in deploying some sort of interim infrastructure to allow the interconnection. So something there that we're aiming for, to see how that will help us improve our ability to get these customers interconnected. But also, some of these customers are also looking at multiple sites, as Anna had mentioned, and they may pick just a handful of them and not move forward with the majority. So we're trying to understand that a little bit better. But that's definitely an area that some of the three IUs, I know I speak for all of us, that it's the challenges that we're really working towards solving.
All right, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Satver, Zanku, Mark, and Max as well for presenting on behalf of all the IUs. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Tyler, but I do know there'll be more opportunities for question and answer during this workshop. So thank you all, and back to Tyler.
Thank you, Ari, and thank you to everybody who presented on behalf of the utilities. I want to make sure that everyone has at least a 5-minute break, so we will be adjourning right now and coming back at 11:30 for the very important presentation on the draft scope of work. See you all in 5 minutes. Hello, everybody. It is 11:30, so we are back from our quick break for the next session, which is the presentation of the draft scope of work. I would like to turn it over to our Energy Division's consultant, Stefan Barson, to begin this discussion.
Great, thank you, Tyler. Can everyone see the slides?
You can see the slides.
Great, okay. So as Tyler mentioned, I'm going to be presenting the draft scope of work, which is, one of the main reasons we are here today. And I'll be presenting part of this, handing some parts off to Rob Peterson, and then wrapping things up. I think throughout this, would plan on taking a pause at a few places to answer questions as we're going along. So I want to remind everybody about some of the scoping questions that we are really trying to focus on and using this scope of work is meant to address. So under track one of the primary goals is to improve basically the distribution planning process and community engagement. So first one is what initial analysis is needed. We've started some of that. The informal outreach meetings that Tyler talked about this morning are our first step. We need to expand that, we think. And then in phase two is what can be done to better engage with many diverse groups in the distribution planning process, and how to make sure that those local concerns are being adequately addressed. In addition to those directly related to distribution planning, we also are looking to gather feedback on what we call track two, or the future grid study. And this is looking at different distribution system operator models of how the distribution system grid could be planned and operated. And one of the things that Rob is going to present are three options that our team and Energy Division have worked together to develop to gather broader feedback than was initially scoped as part of the work that the HighDER consulting team is doing. And I think on that note, I just want to clarify that the consulting team that I'm working with is somewhat separate and more technically focused than what we're talking about hiring a new team to do. And since we were involved with planning this, Verdant will not be able to bid on this new RFP. So getting into the actual scope of work. So when we were developing this in concert with CPUC, we wanted to follow we were looking for models of how we should organize this. And we landed on looking at some of the recent evaluation RFPs that we've received from utilities. And that's what we use as something of a template. And one of the purposes with this is we really wanted to set forth, these are the objectives. This is what we're trying to accomplish and need to accomplish with this scope of work. And then break that into, obviously we need a budget estimate, what the schedule would look like, and then break that into tasks. What we are not proposing right now in this scope of work is a very what we would think is an overly prescriptive approach, and letting teams that are bidding on this some flexibility of how they propose innovative ways to meet these objectives that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So we're trying to accomplish really two related questions of what do communities want and need from distribution planning, and then are there better ways to engage with distribution planning and how that distribution planning process works in response to community needs. So as I think Tyler discussed earlier today, one of the first steps in this were a number of informal community outreach meetings. And these
It looks like we lost Stefan, but I think I've got the slides, so I'm going to go ahead and open these up. There. Going to share my screen. All right. Can someone just let me know if they can see the slides? And I can't see the chat at the moment. So you see it. Thank you.
See them. They're not in presentation mode.
Yep. Getting there.
Yep.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to do presentation mode, Gabe, but I can make this a little bit smaller, bigger. Okay. So let's see. I think Stefan was on. Let's see, where were we? Scoping questions. Oh, he's back.
I'm back. Apologies. At the worst times for your computer decide to crash. Sorry about that. But
okay,
hopefully
I think
people
you're
hear
sharing
me.
again, Stefan. I think you're sharing instead of me, right? That's right.
Yes, I am sharing. So hopefully people can see the informal outreach meeting influence slide. Okay, so
yes.
This morning, Tyler talked about some of the findings and general feedback that we received from these informal outreach meetings. And we drew from this some of the things that I think we wanted to focus on as part of the scope of work. So from the communities, reliability and resiliency were very much top of mind. I think we've all seen and experienced more extreme weather events and wanting to be more resilient in response to those. I think earlier today we've had already some comments about interconnection and delays with interconnections and some frustration there. Affordability and just making sure we have reliable but also affordable energy. And then enabling more clean energy access. So again, some of the points that I think some people already raised in the chat. And then on the utility engagement side, asking for more visibility. I think the utilities have already articulated some steps they're taking towards that. Having more of a partnership, working together with their utilities. And then one of the big ones that we heard a number of times was providing funding for some of this engagement from communities. I think SEE already talked this morning about one of the models they used to help enable that. And then in addition to what the objectives were, we asked about how this study should be executed, who should be doing this, how should it be doing. So one of the key things was leveraging trusted groups, be those community-based organizations, local governments, groups that communities already work with, groups that have already built trust with those communities. Need to show a path to meaningful change. Give people a confidence that this is going to result in something, result in improvements. Also coordinate with many of these other efforts that we've already heard about. Listed a few, the scope of work lists additional ones. And then finally, meeting communities where they are, not requiring, I think as Catherine Buchanan talked about this morning, not requiring somebody in the far northwest corner of the state to come, all the way to Sacramento for a meeting. Reaching out to where those communities are. So as part of that is working with community-based organizations that are already there. And also potentially using working groups. We heard already this morning and also from some participants that you need this long-term engagement. You also need to be providing technical assistance. Some of these groups, especially some of the tribes, have noted they just don't have the technical expertise to fully engage. And finally, need these to be accessible. And that is both basically for those with disabilities, but also in plain language. And then finally, depending on the groups you're reaching out to, need to be able to support multiple languages. So what we're talking about is improving what we're calling a framework of community engagement to identify the needs and the wants of the communities that feeds into this distribution planning process that then has outcomes of interconnecting new loads, providing new services. And then that circles back into the process of engaging with those communities of, okay, at some point, it would be good to understand, are we meeting those needs that those communities have articulated? So we've broken this up into a number of objectives. We have 6 objectives outlined in this scope of work. And the first 2 are basically establishing the current state of affairs or a baseline. In many ways, this would be expanding a lot of the material you already heard presented of what community utilities are already doing for community engagement. So that's that first box. And then how they're responding in the distribution planning to those community needs. And as part of that, not just hearing from utilities. This is where we need to start, this new team needs to start engaging with communities to understand how, on the community engagement for distribution planning, who's talking to who, how is that engagement being done, when's it being done, and then what information is being transferred. Again, we already heard some of this from the utilities this morning, and it's expanding on this and really documenting this in a single place in simple, plain language that everyone can understand of how utilities are currently engaging with communities for their distribution planning processes. And then similarly, on the utility side, more on the utility planning side of how are they responding to these needs? How are they prioritizing some of the increasingly urgent equity needs? And then how does this match with their current processes? And again, developing a memo or maybe a report in simple, plain language that describes how these utilities are currently responding to these community needs. So again, these first 2 objectives are really, shortly after this team would launch of documenting, both from the utility input and community input, how the process is working today. The next objective is to develop what we're calling community advisory groups. And why are we proposing this? So I think taking any of the gaps that have been identified in objectives 1 and 2, and then also expanding that, making sure that non-traditional groups are included, and such as potentially more in disadvantaged communities or other groups that just for variety of reasons might not be currently engaged with their utilities on distribution planning. And then using these groups to inform on the other 3 objectives that Rob and I are going to talk about in a few moments. Who would these groups consist of? So one is we expect they would need to be different or separated by utility. So there would be a group of groups for PG&E, for SCE, and with SDG&E. This also would need to be coordinated with other efforts. Stakeholder fatigue is a very real concern. And I think basing these, again, coming back to community-based organizations as one of the key fundamental vehicles and trusted groups that can be used to reach some of these non-traditional groups. Also with tribal groups. And on the more professional side, and I think this is where a lot of engagement is already happening, is with local governments and professional planners. How is that process working? And providing a feedback mechanism to improve on, again, the memos established in objectives 1 and 2. So when would this happen? Again, the intent would be the new team would start forming these soon after they were in contract. And then these groups would, I think we're estimating we're on for approximately 6 months, with a good first part of that being education. What is the current process? What additional needs do you need to communicate? What's working? What needs to be improved? And that gets into the 4th objective of developing and then evaluating metrics about getting back to those 3 steps of how well is community engagement currently working for distribution planning? How well does the distribution planning process translate those needs into outcomes? And then how are those outcomes actually, that's circling back to meet those community needs? So what forms might these consist of? So I think, as mentioned, they're within, or we've listed in the scope of work, some examples such as the climate and resiliency proceeding, and also the microgrids proceeding, that are looking at similar approaches, but their metrics are looking at different aspects. I think here what we really would be looking at is providing reliable and resilient service, interconnecting new loads to enable the ambitious plans that the state has for clean energy, maintaining affordability, and doing a better improving equity and equitable access. And then finally, enabling more local clean energy, and that gets into that interconnection one. These are again what we heard from those informal outreach meetings, and I think these would need to be refined and vetted with those community advisory groups. And as deliverables, there would be a list of metrics that we'll break out as task 4. And then these are going to be used to guide and inform what you'll hear about in later tasks in a moment. So maybe I do not have the chat in front of me, but are there any questions we should answer now before stepping into talking about future grid study questions?
Stefan, I don't see any in the chat yet, or any hands raised just yet.
Wow, I must have put everyone to sleep.
I take it back. We just got a new hand up from Bill Peter. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Bill Peter, PG, yeah. You guys can hear me?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, could you just I didn't quite follow everything in the prior slide, the distribution planning advisory group, and so I'm thinking others may. Maybe can you just talk through it, and then you also talked about how your scope of work would leave it a little bit to the vendor, is that partly why it's like, or can you just talk through this again, maybe? What exactly is the community advisory group? Would they be hosting meetings? Describe it a bit more. Maybe I just missed it. Apologies.
Again, the intent is to leave some of these details up to the bidder of how these are going to be, the details of how these are going to be structured. But one purpose of these groups is to basically be the intermediate between the focus point of reaching out to local communities, and that would include hosting meetings of working with the community-based organization or whoever is leading these to host local meetings, to draw, and these may need to be held after working hours, to draw in some of those non-traditional community members to hear what they need from a distribution planning system. And it's really the intent is to expand and collaborate with some of the work that the utilities are already doing. Does that help?
I mean, I would add, so Bill, when we talked with PG&E about some of their climate adaptation proceeding outreach that's already started. And one of the things we heard was that in the Bay Area, where PG&E started outreach, was they developed groups. I'm not sure if the word focus group was used or how the groups were named, but it was groups of individuals that they would meet with to get input about, aspects required under that climate adaptation proceeding outreach. I think so that this is a similar concept, is where you have groups developed, that are samples of different areas or for different communities that could advise, give us input from those communities.
Thanks for talking it through. And then, exactly how those groups are run would be part of whatever vendor is bidding into the scope of work propose. And maybe that might be, leveraging existing forums, for example.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for explaining it. Appreciate it.
Any other questions, or maybe move on to the options that we're looking for feedback on for the future grid study? Not hearing anything. Rob, you want to take it away?
Sure. Yeah, good. That's a good slide to start with. So this image shows essentially what was in the work plan that was already adopted in November with the scoping ruling, with a few updates. And so under this plan that was adopted, there was a white paper that was issued, and that's available on the GridWorks website, which I put a link to there. And we held a workshop about the white paper. We held another workshop then in August focused on outreach that would be associated with track 2, but also track 1, distribution planning being the focus on track 1 and distribution system operations track 2. We have today's workshop, and early next year we expect to start the technical workshop series that would result in the development of a draft and then a final future grid study. An en banc was also envisioned by the scoping ruling, which is when all 5 commissioners get together in a single workshop, and we would plan to hear from experts on distribution system operations and hear other presentations. That would lead to a decision, and then that may modify or update the future grid study in some way. That was already envisioned, and our existing HighDER consulting team is supporting this as envisioned. That includes Verdant, where Stefan is from, and also GridWorks, which is going to be facilitating the future grid study development. So in addition, this draft scope of work for a new consultant, which we're talking about right now, considers 3 options for further supporting outreach related to these technical workshop series and draft future grid study development. We heard loud and clear that we want to make sure that non-traditional stakeholders have a voice as we consider the future grid and how distribution systems may be operated. So, and we do want feedback on those options. So, and we expect formal comments to be requested in a ruling to come out in the near future. And so comments on these options is highly desirable. Next slide, 7. Okay, so I'm going to go through the 3 different options in the scope of work, and that draft scope of work, which was issued yesterday, has a few more details. I'm limiting this to just 3 slides, so I'll talk through some of this verbally. The first option is practically status quo, but with a lot more Energy Division staff engagement. We have a larger team now on HighDER proceeding, and our staff would coordinate community feedback during the preparation of the draft future grid study and after it's issued. We'd also make use of our existing HighDER consulting team during that outreach, although that support would be limited in scope as they have an executed contract, and this would be adding to it. Not adding to it, but just it's part of an existing contract which has a lot of work in it. Is a better way to say it. So the new consultant would not be scoped to support future grid study outreach, and the scope of work explains that this option 1 provides a balance of benefits in terms of maintaining proceeding schedule, while ensuring voices from diverse stakeholders are considered during the draft future grid study development process. It also is expected to be the least cost to ratepayers because the new consultant would not be scoped to work on outreach, and so the budget would be, there would not be additional budget. And in comparing the 3 options, we looked at schedule, engagement, and budget, and that's the headings you'll see in the draft scope of work when we looked at the 3 different options. That's option 1. And if you want to go to next slide, step. Okay, so these graphics on this slide and the next one that you'll see are not supposed to be exact. It's hard to predict exactly where activities will occur a year or 2 from now. But in general, the arrows are showing that there would be delay. And because as the other team would have to be hired, they would also under this option need to start doing outreach to prepare for the en banc. So option 2 is the new consultant presents community feedback at track 2 en banc, which is already planned, and documents feedback in an appendix to the distribution planning community engagement needs assessment study. So that study is really the focus of this scope of work, and this appendix would be added to it. So by adding that appendix to it, you're adding additional scope, which could ultimately cause some delay in track 1, as well as track 2, which is something we talk about in the review of this option. The en banc would be held after the new consulting team collects only initial community feedback. So the en banc delay and draft future grid study delay would be less than you would see under option 3, which I'll present in a moment.
Hey, Rob, you might want to just talk through what is an en banc. There was a question in the chat, and I think it's
an en banc is when all 5 commissioners join the same workshop, which doesn't happen all that often. And they usually, it's like a full day workshop, and there are presentations from experts in the field, or in this case, there would be presentations on the draft future grid study, possibly from a new consulting team that did some outreach to get feedback on that draft future grid study. And that's what occurs at an en banc. It's a fancy way of saying workshop, essentially. Good question. So in this case, again, I mentioned final outreach would then be documented after the en banc. And so there'd be, again, minimal slowdown of getting the draft future grid study out, but then a full reporting of what the new consultant heard from communities about the draft future grid study would then be an appendix. And in general, in terms of schedule, engagement, and budget, option 2 is expected to result in proceeding delay, but offers the benefit of broader-based outreach on a future grid study than option 1 would. Unlike option 1, the new consultant would be scoped to support future grid study outreach. But budget in this case would be, although it would be added, would be less than required under option 3, which I'll get to now. The next slide. Okay, so option 3, last option. In this case, the new consultant would be scoped to support future grid study outreach, to get robust and meaningful comments on that future grid study, and prepare a new deliverable, which would be called a future grid study community feedback report. And they would present the draft version of this report at the track 2 en banc. So you'll notice the arrows are a bit bigger here. We would delay, in this case, future grid study the future grid study and the en banc, so that there's time to both hire the consultant and for them to complete a full draft of a deliverable, which is on this future grid study community feedback report. So after the en banc, the consultant would complete a final version of that draft report, and it would be issued. And in terms of schedule, engagement, and in budget, option 3 is expected to result in the greatest amount of proceeding delay, but would also result in the most robust outreach on the future grid study. The new consultant would be scoped to support the future grid study outreach, and option 3 would then also require likely the largest budget. So those are the 3 options. I tried to present that as cleanly as I could. It's not, it's kind of a mouthful, all the reports. So I'm happy to take questions. Stefan, do we want to do that now or
yeah, I think let's maybe address the specific ones to this now, and then there are one or two other ones we maybe address after my part.
Okay.
So I think Amin from Cal Advocates asked, do staff have expertise in performing community non-traditional stakeholder outreach?
Well, I will say we recently completed what I consider to be very successful informal outreach with 20 different groups. And it was a diverse group, including tribal members, in local government, including elected local officials, and also community-based organizations and advocacy groups. So that's a recent example of the experience this team has. So in short, I'd say yes.
Thank you. And then two other ones I can quickly address is one is from Laureen of there are many existing community processes. How can we piggyback on those? So I think absolutely those need to be coordinated with. And then, I think we've listed out many of those that we are aware of and the scope of work, and it's going to be up to the bidder to provide a clear path on that. And then Jessica had a question of what is the problem we're trying to solve for and how will success be measured? And I think good question. Not an easy one. Rob, do you want to take that?
Well, I mean, you talked a bit about distribution planning already and the metrics. And so that's one topic area that we're trying to investigate and see if improvements can be made on distribution planning. For the future grid study, the problem, I'm not going to use the word problem because it's not the right word. The change in the future is that we anticipate a lot more DERs interconnected to the grid, especially electric vehicles, but also HVAC systems, and it's a lot of new load from resources located that can provide generation even that are located in the grid, as you know well, and in addition to those resources outside, around the grid, the utility scale ones, so two-way flows of power, et cetera. So what this future grid study is looking at is, what does that mean for the future of having DERs so widespread and with such high penetration throughout the system? What's the right approach for operating the grid under that environment? So I think that's the problem. And we want to make sure that stakeholders that are not as technical or certainly don't have the bandwidth to participate in our proceedings as full parties have a voice in that future because it matters to them. And so the problem here, I guess, is getting non-traditional stakeholder voices captured in the development and especially in commenting on the findings from that draft future grid study.
And then I think last question on future grid study from Karen Nelson is who chooses the option to move forward with? Community stakeholders need a voice in this, and today's panelist comment opportunity is certainly not sufficient. I assume there's a plan to acquire comments about these options.
Yeah. So we expect a rule, like the ruling announcing this date, today's date, includes a line that explains and I don't expect Karen you to have read this, but that's just saying what was in there, that there would be a future ruling coming soon that requests formal comments on this scope of work. And stakeholders would then provide their feedback on what they think should be in it. And ultimately, a decision is expected to be a proposed decision written by the administrative law judge that is then voted out in the form of a decision by the commission, which could then result in the hiring of a consultant to meet this scope. So that's the process. There'd be a ruling on comments and then a decision voted out by the commission. After that, if the consultant team is selected to be hired, there would be a request for proposals process and a hiring process.
And then Jessica did make a comment that the metrics might be outside of the scope of this proceeding, or some of those listed. And I think that's actually a great great comment, that, you know, this proceeding does have definite goals and definite you know, scope of what should be in there. So I think reviewing those example metrics to make sure they're in line with the proceeding and scope of the proceeding is definitely something that we will take to heart. And I think, Roger, I will get to your comment after I think I wrap up the end of this, but do you think there's some valuable points there? Okay, so last objective is developing a report on distribution planning, community needs, and also developing recommended improvements to better meet those needs. So the first one is looking at how to improve that distribution planning and outcomes framework. And this gets into one of the key points of the this proceeding is leading up to the staff proposal at the end of this is making improvements to the whole distribution planning process. But as parts of that is, are there opportunities to improve how the distribution planning process responds to community needs? Identifying those metrics I talked about, evaluating those. It may include, could include recommendation that those be reevaluated on a somewhat regular basis. And then establishing some approaches for a long-term partnership. This long-term back and forth that I think we already heard some comments about this morning. Rob already talked about the schedule, and for track 1, this is really trying to feed into a staff proposal and proposed decision in near the end of 2024. Budget. This is intended to be a pretty broad scope. So total of $2 million is our estimate, of which a significant portion is going to be allocated to those community groups. I should note that this budget is right now centered around including option 3. So for these community groups, it's both engaging on the distribution planning process, but also directly engaging on the future grid study and providing feedback on that. This is a little bit more of a graphical schedule. So today we are having this this workshop, and then as Rob said, there would be a ruling requesting feedback and then a proposed decision, likely ordering utilities to proceed with the scope of work, resulting in a launch an RFP, hopefully by the middle of next year, getting this new team and having in contract by Q3, ideally, and then follow that up with basically a research plan. And I'll get this is outlined more in the statement of work, but this research plan is really identifying what's this new group going to do? How are they going to establish these community advisory groups, and how are they going to use those to provide feedback on the distribution, on community needs and the distribution planning process, but depending on the option, also gathering feedback and developing a report on the draft future grid study. Also, and ideally early 2024 would be those 2 memos I described. So these would be to outline what the current community engagement process is, and then how is the distribution planning process responding to that. This leads up to the major deliverable would be this draft distribution planning community need engagement needs assessment study, and also a workshop to present those results. And then that would some of these recommendations and findings would then be pulled into the distribution planning process staff proposal. And this staff proposal is in scope for the HighDER proceeding. And basically the HighDER consulting team working with Energy Division. So as I mentioned, we have broken this down into tasks. Basically general project management, conducting research, material review and interviews. That's where those two objective 1 and objective 2 memos come from. And then developing a detailed research plan based on, again, benchmarking the current process, and then outlining how in detail they're going to recruit and then work with these community advisory groups. How are they going to develop and getting into development of those metrics, and then providing feedback depending on the option chosen, potentially on the future grid study, but definitely in developing a report outlining the distribution planning community engagement needs assessment. One of the other tasks that is built into this is, as this outreach is being done, developing a comprehensive database of all this feedback. So there would be a traceable source of all the feedback that is gathered in a accessible format. Might be able to do this in Excel or maybe Access or another format that would be delivered to the CPUC for reference in both this work and also potentially other future work. And then finally, supporting the staff proposal that I mentioned a few times is really looking at improving the distribution planning process. And then this is a cross-reference between how each objective maps to each of those tasks. And I think a lot of that is in the scope of work. And I think there's some questions that I want to spend some time addressing and point people again to the document describing many of these tasks and how those map into the objectives. So Roger Lynn had a comment. Appreciate staff's work to do recent outreach, but that does not eliminate unfortunate trust barriers to adequate deployment of clean energy resources in ESA communities. The ESA Action Plan recommends meaningful engagement with non-traditional stakeholders, not just soliciting their opinions. And question, how does the SOW intend to address these barriers? So I think that's where the intent with these community advisory groups comes in, and using and identifying local trusted organizations, be them community-based organizations, tribal leaders, or others, to make sure that you're, again, working with those organizations to leverage the trust they already have with their communities. Now I realize that's really identifying the, listening to people's input. I think the other part is where we start talking about developing of those metrics and then recommendations to address those metrics. So feeding into a process to include basically a plan to improve the distribution planning process is the pathway that I think we've envisioned. But I don't know, Rob, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I'll add something. It's a bit more, we were forward thinking in the development of the scope of work, but as Energy Division staff and the consulting team, we kind of have to draw a limit at this proceedings end. That's when their contract ends. It's when Energy Division, I'm assigned to this one proceeding. But when we think of these advisory groups, especially when we think of the metrics, there's the potential, if they're successful, for longer term use and potentially revisiting some of these ideas some point in the future or not. I mean, it'll be up to the commission, how they want to proceed. But I think we've developed some concepts in here that would lead to longer term potential engagement. And so I just wanted to add that carefully.
And then we have a question from Amin with Cal Advocates. Where do budget funds come from? And do we have an answer for that, or is that something we need to?
So what would happen is this would have to be voted out by commission decision, because ratepayer funds would be used to provide for this. The estimate is $2 million budget, and so we take formal and informal comments, formal and informal comments, probably not informal. We'd be taking formal comments on this draft scope of work and a ruling to be issued in the near future. Those would be used to develop on the record feedback that would be part of a proposed decision that ultimately gets voted out by the commission. And then in that would be a cost cap for the hiring of a future team.
And another question from Jessica of how will the draft community outreach report impact the future grid study? And I think the answer is it depends on the option selected. But I don't know, Rob, if you want to talk through, and I can.
Oh yeah, sorry, I was reading ahead on some of the comments. This is Jessica's comment on. Yeah, so how does the draft relate to the future grid study, or how might it impact this outreach report? So a couple things. Energy Division is planning under all of the options. Option 1 explains it, but option 1 is part of option 2 and 3. Energy Division would be engaging with communities around the technical workshop period to help make sure.
Just to clarify that it was for option 3.
Right. I just wanted.
I'm sorry.
To explain.
I was trying to
how the outreach.
I'm
right.
sorry.
That's all right. So we would have outreach during development of the future grid study, but then after the study is developed, it's not clear to me, or it may not be, that additional feedback from the community that leads to a community feedback report would be part of the future grid study, because it was developed based on a workshop series during a time frame with stakeholders engaged, and then there'd be additional feedback after the development of that report. So if one is a reporting of the past, it's like you have another report that's additional. And so I think the consultant would be feeding into a decision adopting the future grid study and considerations about that study, but it may not directly change the draft future grid study. It's more of providing a larger considerations for the commission to think about as they review the future grid study. That's how I'm imagining it.
And then Jessica had another question to confirm the proposed $2 million budget covers development of the study and associated recommendations, but it would not cover implementation, evaluation of any recommendations, nor ongoing future outreach. And if that would be separate, can we develop an estimate for that ongoing cost?
No, we can't. I mean, and to Roger's question too, this is one. We're focused on this proceeding and these deliverables. We're setting up some concepts that may be useful for future outreach considerations, but we haven't stepped that far. And so we want to see what we learned from this process, and then it'll be up to the commission and the commissioner and the ALJ, and parties to think about what could happen in the future. But that's not where we're going right now.
Anna Brooks has her hand up.
I would like to jump in and say that Audrey has had their hand up for a little bit.
Sorry.
Thank you, Audrey Chinose, East Bay Clean Power Alliance. I did add a question to the chat, and I'm very poor at the keyboard, so it didn't come out quite well. But my question is this: how flexible is the schedule and the tasks that you have outlined? And I ask because I'd like to propose an excursion of this inquiry into the microgrid proceeding, which in itself, of course, is very huge. But, you know, I think microgrids may be a point at which this inquiry and underserved communities can meet. You know, the problem with a lot of these inquiries are they're very abstract, but I think there are sort of microgrids of varied kinds and sizes that will take you into meeting more of the underserved communities, community solar, all sorts of different kinds of microgrids that people want to develop. So that's just my question. How flexible are you? Can you kind of take a look at the microgrid proceedings and kind of extract from that maybe some sense or some actually hard data of what kinds of small microgrids communities are interested in developing, and trying to dialogue and form, you know, I mean, how should I, dialogue. I don't know. My vocabulary is a little limited here. But, you know, talk to these communities about what they want, what they need. So thank you very much. I really appreciate this whole effort. It's really hard to follow and participate, but I think it's, of course, worthwhile because DERs are really the way to go. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Audrey. And I do remember talking with you when we did our outreach, and thank you for joining us again today. It's really nice hearing from you again. So two parts, so flexibility and schedule, and I think focus on community microgrids and development opportunities for them. So the schedule flexibility is a tough one. We do have a scope and schedule that's been adopted by the commission. We're looking at options today that may impact what the scope and schedule, and maybe some changes need to be made. I will just note that one of the hard deadlines I'm aware of, in addition to what the adopted schedule is our HighDER consultant contract ends in September 2025. And so that's a hard stop for consultant support under this contract. But to what extent the commission determines that the scope and schedule should be adjusted is up to the assigned office and ALJ and stakeholder comments to determine. There could be some flexibility depending on what's decided there. And in terms of how we think about microgrids, we are tracking that proceeding. It's ongoing. There are complex issues at work there. And as we develop the future grid study, both in the technical workshop process, which you can see in the image here for next year, and whatever option we choose for additional engagement, I have a feeling that's going to continue to come up. And so we'll think about it in terms of future grid operations. We'll think about microgrids in terms of what's found on that study, and also as a DER. So I think as we engage with the communities, we'll hear more about them and continue to, as they are a DER type, they are in scope of this proceeding.
Okay, thank you.
And it looks like Anna Brooks has her hand up, or has had her hand up.
Yeah, thanks for allowing the question. So I don't know if there was a slide previously that talked about the scope of work and the stakeholder engagement and identifying the stakeholders, developing relationships with them, and then talking with them about this issue. And I just wonder, I know the commission as well as all of the IOUs are very, very focused on reducing costs to the customer. And, a $2 million study isn't a ton of money by utility standards, but it is money. And I wonder if there are efficiencies to be had by utilizing the existing community advisory groups that exist within PG&E, SCE, and SCG&E. We have really robust groups of community members that represent, disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, cities and counties, tribal communities. And I wonder if there are efficiencies to be had, and we could use some of our forums to improve the process.
It's a good comment. I think that's about as far as we can go with it. I think it's good. You'll have an opportunity to put similar comments in writing if you'd like to for the utilities. And I mean, it's possible. I don't have a full answer at the moment, though. And the counter argument is, well, we need a complete third party study, and that might somehow influence it. I don't know if folks would make that argument, but I think there are multiple positions that could come up with respect to your comment.
Okay, and I guess what I would offer, so I can't, I'm speaking for PG&E, not all of the IOUs in this sense, but we have, really robust lists and, contact information for the stakeholders that we have. So if it would help to not have to recreate the wheel for whichever consultant is chosen to come in and start talking with these folks, we would be happy to share that, if that's a good starting point. If you're not using our forums, but you want to use our contact and information, we would offer that.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you.
That would be fabulous. Thank you. I believe Lorraine was next in line with her hand.
Hello. Thank you for this engaging conversation. I am wondering, this piggybacks on what Anna said and what some others have said earlier about existing community processes and visions and efficiencies. We're going through some pretty extensive community visioning for grants for our affordable housing community, for example, that are relevant to this and that it's already taking place in another track. We've had significant community engagement around our mobility and climate action plans. And so I'm just wondering in the scope, the way I understood the questions you're asking, what it needs to be known is to what degree have a lot of communities already engaged in some of these things? And can we sort of cut to the chase on a few things and not have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak? And that's also related to this earlier conversation about projects that haven't come to fruition, microgrid type, some of the attrition rate. And there were community engagement processes surrounding some local efforts to establish a microgrid, for example. I wonder if we really need to go through a lot of some things already. So adopting a criteria by which existing community engagement can suffice might be useful. Not to say that we don't need to redo a few things, but so that's one thing, one comment. And then to what degree is the community involved in a lot of very specifics about the grid, future grid? I think statements of values are very important, and maybe that's covered in wants and needs, but I am very wary and appreciate your addressing fatigue, because I think that's a genuine issue, especially for communities that are already doing, have already been pushing this, or for communities that just don't have the bandwidth to really absorb everything.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I think the possibility of somehow coordinating with the utilities, but not becoming, still keeping our third-party separation in some way to address stakeholder burnout, certainly on our minds as a possibility. We do want to see what stakeholders have to say on that, but I think that could help.
Yes, I didn't mean coordinate with utilities as much as maybe some of our local governments or existing CBOs. I mean,
yeah, I think both.
Great.
Yeah, I think both sides. Right.
Both sides, yeah. Thank you so much.
So we are at 12:29, and we had scheduled to do lunch from 12:30 to 1. So it might be a good opportunity to take that break. We do have time, we do have a panel after lunch that, now that you've gotten the brief review of the statement of work, looking for feedback from them. And then also later this afternoon, more open discussion. And this gives you a chance to digest and maybe, read, skim the scope of work while you're eating lunch. And look forward to more comments this afternoon. And Tyler, anything else?
No, thank you. Think you covered it. We'll be breaking for lunch now. Please return in 30 minutes at 1 o'clock for our community panel. Look forward to seeing you there.
Mike?